Hi, my name is Tabitha. I'm an autism mom and the mom of a bullied victim. I'm requesting your support in taking legal action against Howard County Public School System and demanding the resignation of its superintendent, Bill Barnes. As a parent of two children who have navigated through multiple special education programs, I know the struggle is real. And I am so familiar with that one daunting and unsettling question that lingers relentlessly in the minds of every special needs parent. A question that many can identify, causing an indescribable sense of uncertainty that gnaws from within them. That constant wonder that if anything were to happen to them, what would become of their children? It's a raw but harsh reality that many face because we all want to be there for our children, to love them, support them, protect them, and lead them down the path of least resistance. But the reality is, life just doesn't work that way. So we cling to a thread of hope with that one mustard seed of faith that our many prayers for our children will one day manifest. My mother and grandmother instilled in me that knowledge is power, and education is the key to unlock that power. They set the bar high, but that's the standard I've always lived by, which is why I strongly believe that positioning my children to receive the best education and access to exponential resources to support their needs was the most effective and valuable action I could have taken as a parent. This wouldn't only help them to reach their maximal potential to become independent and self-sufficient adults, but give them the knowledge to know when they're being treated unfairly and the ability to advocate for themselves so they could conquer this crazy and cruel world. This was the one action on my part that I was hoping would gain closure for me to that one settling question. Like every other parent, I want the best for my children, which is why I relocated to Howard County in 2010 for its top-notch schools that are now rated number 1 in the state of Maryland. And Maryland ranks number 3 in the nation. That's a huge win for special education students, especially in Howard County. But I had to ask myself, how did Howard County become number 1? Was it at the expense of some of its students? Most parents know there is no perfect school system because there are no perfect people, and people run the school system. But over the years, during my journey with autism and bullying, some real and disturbing truths became transparent to me as my children's disability rights were being heavily violated. And the crazy part is, it wasn't by accident. It had gotten so bad that in March 2024, I literally dropped everything and relocated my family nearly 1,500 miles away just so my autistic son could be treated fairly with dignity and respect and receive the free, appropriate public education that not only he was entitled to, but that's required in every state in this nation. And let me be clear, this move was not just an inconvenience. It put my family in a massive financial hardship that we are still struggling with. But I didn't want to see my son mistreated, so I moved. That's why being a special needs parent will make the weak strong, especially when advocating for your child's disability rights. But regardless of doing everything in my power to ensure my children's needs were met, Howard County staff failed them miserably, beyond measure, with its inadequate leadership, incompetent decision-making skills, poor communication skills, lack of accountability, and later, acts of retaliation after I filed 2 state complaints. That's illegal and a violation of the American Disabilities Act. These are not the characteristics of a number 1 school system, where smaller concerns convert to larger concerns, which require escalating the matter up the chain of command, still with no response. But when all else failed, my expectation as a parent was the buck would stop at the level of the superintendent. When I think superintendent, I think of a leader who is committed to excellence. That position requires being responsible for so many people. First, the staff, being a role model and leading by example, not cutting corners and displaying biased behaviors. Number two, for the parent, there has to be a trust factor, knowing that that superintendent will do what's right on behalf of that parent's child and will communicate effectively with the parent to reach real resolutions, but yet still establish accountability for himself and his staff. But most importantly, number three, being committed to the student he serves by ensuring their safety, protecting their mental health, creating an environment for all students to thrive so they can reach their maximal potential, and setting the tone for every student to reach high for excellence. The parent can't do this alone. The goal is to work as a team to achieve a common goal. And that goal is excellence, no matter what it looks like for that specific student. It's virtually impossible to put in the bare minimal effort and expect a maximal result. Let me also be clear about the level of my complaint. In the written part of this petition, you will find a list of nearly every person that I contacted from Howard County on out, from the county executive, Calvin Ball, to our state representative, Congressman John Sarbanes. And I received no help. I even reached out to the White House. Now that's a special needs parent for you. But my call was blocked by the person who answered, and I was basically recycled back to John Sarbanes. So I explained that I had not gotten any results when I reached out to the congressman. I still got no help. Maryland is where my complaint still lies. My complaint never left Maryland. This was really discouraging and disheartening. And it makes me wonder if all these people on this list are in some way in cahoots with Howard County to keep them under the wrap so they can maintain their pristine school ranking. Because it's just not fair that during my children's journey, the minimal effort contributed by this number one school system produced low confidence and low self-esteem in both of my children due to academic negligence and ignored bullying. It produced social and emotional trauma, exacerbated behavioral disturbances, and mental health trauma that can only be completely restored by God Himself. My children had goals, dreams, and aspirations, just like every other student in Howard County. But the staff that held my children's lives and their futures in the palm of their hands treated their lives and their future as if it had no value. No student and no parent should ever have to experience this type of blatant neglect or disrespect that my family endured. You know, I often reflect on the past when my children were thriving and making great strides. Those were such great memories, but that's all it is. It's a memory with no continuum reflecting their actual outcome. It breaks my heart immensely every time I see my son, who was speaking so clearly and reading at 5th grade level, regress to the point where now he's reading kindergarten and stumbling over his words. And my daughter, who was once this sassy, bold young lady with so much confidence and self-esteem, but now she's so withdrawn, with low confidence, low self-esteem, feeling like she's not worthy of anything or anyone. In those moments, when I see the negative impact that this school system has had on my children's lives, I just wonder what it would have been like if the staff would have simply just did their job and did what was right on behalf of my children in that moment. Because truthfully, after the trauma they endured, it feels like playing a game of Russian roulette with their life. Any administrative staff, superintendent, county official, state representative, aware that a student's disability rights are being violated and you don't take action, you are a part of the problem and you are a threat to that student's future. So yes, my children's disability rights and my parental rights were severely violated with no care by Howard County. And interestingly, many of those staff, I can't say they do their job, but they certainly go to their job. But at the end of the day, they go home to their typical children and enjoy their normal lives. So they just don't get it. But God forbid if even one of them had to walk in the shoes of a special needs parent. Sadly, that's when they'll finally get it. You see, there is nothing normal about the life of a special needs parent. Having to call the mobile crisis team 2 to 3 times per week per child to assist with behaviors that were induced by Howard County's lack of accountability, or having the cops in your home so many times that they know the floor plan of your house, or even having your children go in and out of the hospital like a revolving door. A daughter who struggled with bullying so much that she was hospitalized for suicidal ideations, all because the staff didn't want to follow the bullying protocol. Or my son, who was hospitalized nearly 1,000 days, intermittently over the course of 3.5 years, initiated by Howard County not intervening when a non-public school illegally transitioned him out of his normal classroom. So I have a front row seat of what many don't know that goes on behind closed doors within this number 1 school system. I have a very big heart, a strong passion and compassion for the special needs community. So I'm not just speaking out on behalf of my children, because for them, the damage has already been done. I'm speaking out on behalf of every student who cannot speak up for themselves, and every parent who is in fear of facing retaliation, like the retaliation that I'm still facing as I speak. I call it administrative bullying. When anyone listed in this petition is aware that a student's disability rights are being heavily violated, matter of fact, 2 students, and you don't step up to the plate to intervene, you are allowing administrative bullying within Howard County Public School System. And it doesn't stop there. It just continues. Just like positions continue to get passed on to the next bad leader, putting up a facade as if they really care about these special education students. But what they really care about is maintaining Howard County's pristine ranking as number 1. So I just have 3 simple questions. Number 1, how does something like this happen to 2 students in the same household? Number 2, how is it possible to be a number 1 school system blatantly violating a student's disability rights? And number 3, how did Howard County become number 1? Was it at the expense of some of its students? For me personally, every life of every special needs student matters. It matters because these children have potential. It may only be visible in the parents' eyes right now, but how dare any school system staff strip that parent's hope of their child's potential and to use that child as a living sacrifice just to maintain a school district's pristine rankings as number 1? That's just not okay. Any student who is led in the wrong direction by its leader, that's a life and a worthy future that is potentially lost. So I'm inspired by my passion, which prompted me to start the process to make a change, which is why I'm asking for your support in signing this petition. Now, the best way to understand how we even got to this point is to understand some of the background history. Starting with my son, who has high functioning autism with a history of multiple incidents of physical abuse and mental abuse, his downhill journey with Howard County began really during the 2015-2016 school year when the special education department ignored my complaint regarding his non public placement. The Strawbridge School at that time, without my knowledge or consent, removed him from his high functioning class of 6 students and placed him in a classroom with one student who had significant challenges, and his native language was profanity. I started to notice behavior changes in him during the beginning of the school year, but I didn't really understand what was going on because the prior school year, I mean, he was just making such great strides, coming home with these big words. And, his teacher reported he was raising his hand and he was answering questions. For him, that was great because he didn't start talking until he was 7. So for him to really get engaged like that, that was like a huge accomplishment. But apparently his behaviors were an issue. The thing was, all the kids in that classroom had behavior challenges, but he was the only one who was just starting to get introduced to medication. Transitioning was always a struggle for him. At the beginning of the school year, I started to notice significant changes in his behavior that modeled property destruction and profanity, and he had never cursed a day in his life. So I asked the school about any changes that were going on, and they denied any changes in his routine. So about 5 months later, my son and I were chit-chatting about school and talking about his school day, and I was asking him some questions about some of the kids that I remembered in his class. And he told me that there was only one student in his class, and he told me the student's name, and he said he curses too much. I was confused because we didn't normally talk about his day too much because he was often agitated, and if he didn't really want to talk about it, he wouldn't talk about it. So this was a really rare day that he just was very, talkative. And when he told me that, my antennas went up because I noticed that, he had been cursing and he had never done it before. So this was new. So when I contacted the school, they told me there were no changes in his behavior. They had still not noticed anything. He was doing wonderful. And I spoke with the psychiatrist at the school who would observe him in his classroom setting on a regular basis, and his social worker who took him out of the class every day for whatever sessions she had. And they reported no change. Later, there was a new social worker that came on board, and she wasn't aware that I guess I wasn't supposed to know about this change. And when I asked her about it, she actually told me, yeah, he's in a classroom with one other student, and they're on the same level. They were not on the same level. So I contacted the special education department and informed them what was going on. And we had an emergency IEP meeting, and that meeting was just insane. After that meeting, my son's teacher ended up quitting, and the only student in his class was removed, and he was in this classroom all by himself. I was like, that's crazy. So I contacted the special education department and let them know, hey, we need to do something. We need to intervene because, this can't happen. And the response I received was my concerns would be addressed at his next annual review, which was nearly 30 days away. That was crazy. I mean, it was incomprehensible that the special education department would allow a student to sit in a classroom by himself with no teacher, with no peers, and just his one-to-one aid. Clearly, the education piece he wouldn't be getting if there was no teacher, and social interaction was one of the goals on his IEP, but he had no peers. Meanwhile, his behaviors were becoming so escalated to the point where he was now demonstrating property destruction and the profanity was off the chain. So I continued to try to get Howard County to intervene, and they did nothing. Just days before my son's annual review, he experienced his first hospitalization due to aggressive behaviors. I was really disheartened by that because this could have all been prevented if the special education department would have kicked in, but they didn't. That hospitalization followed 944 days of hospitalizations intermittently over the course of 3.5 years. And that did not include the days and sometimes weeks that he spent in the emergency room waiting for a bed. So his last hospitalization was 1 year and 6 days. And throughout all of his hospitalizations, I had heavily advocated for home and hospital and the special services, speech and OT, that he was entitled to. Home and hospital is a service that allows a teacher to come into the hospital and provide educational services. He was also eligible for speech and OT, and those services could also be provided in the hospital as well. Unfortunately, those services never started until his last hospitalization, and it's not even well documented that a teacher came in more than maybe 3 or 4 times. So once those significant behaviors began, there was really no school in the state of Maryland that could meet his needs. Either the school could accommodate his high functioning status but could not accommodate his behaviors, or they could accommodate his behaviors, but the student population it served was not a good fit for him. So he remained in the hospital, and really the county did nothing. No meetings, nothing. There was not even a discussion about what the plan was going to be for him. So I initiated an emergency IEP and let them know, hey, look, we need to do something to get him placed. I mean, he can't just sit in the hospital and rot away. No one really did anything, and I started looking for placements on my own. So after thoroughly checking out all the schools in Maryland, I knew there were no schools that could meet his needs. So I started looking out of state. Finally, I found a school that I thought would really accommodate his needs. It was called the Bancroft School in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. And I was really excited about this school because they had statistics that claimed that they could improve behaviors by 60%. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. So Howard County gave me a lot of pushback, but ultimately they did place my son at the Bancroft School in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. And he was at that school for about 4 years. So to fast forward and bring you up to speed, last year on July 10th, my son reported that a staff at the Bancroft School tried to choke him. Now, that was kind of crazy because no one had told me about it, and I didn't find out about this report until 2 days later, which was a red flag. So when I spoke with the person at the school regarding this incident, she said, oh, well, we don't usually report to the parent right away. We have to get the facts and we want to look at the video. And she said, everything came out fine. There was no restraint or anything. So I was like, okay, but I wanted to speak to him because this was my first time finding out about any of this. She said I had to wait until he got out of school, end of the day, and he would call me. And I said, no, I want to speak to him right now. So she says, no, you can't do that. So I contacted the police to do a well-being check on my son because I'm in Maryland and he's in New Jersey. And I'm just finding out about this incident. And I really didn't know anything about what was going on. So I contacted Howard County immediately and I left multiple messages with the front desk staff, never got a call back. I also sent an email and informed them that, they wouldn't let me see my son and, told them everything that happened. And I got a response about 10 o'clock that night that she would follow up in the morning. The night of the incident, I received a call from the staff, and it just so happened to be the staff that my son reported, who told me about, oh, there was an incident, your son was banging the van and broke some of the windows. And he didn't know anything else, never said anything about a restraint, never said anything about putting his hands around his neck, nothing. I asked to speak to my son that night, and all he did was scream, I don't want to talk about it. So everything was now making sense from that night to that day that I got the report. So a police officer went out to the school to do a well-being check, and he said, oh, everything was fine. There was no report of a restraint. There was no documentation of a restraint. Your son was fine. So I'm like, okay, well, that's good. So he told me that part of the process was the following day, a detective would go out to look at the surveillance camera. So the following day, the detective contacted me and said, hey, I'm about to go over to the school, check out the video. And he would give me a call when he was done. He called me after he had left the school and said that everything seemed to be fine. There was no documentation of a restraint. My son seemed to be doing well, but the school would not allow him to see the video. That was strange, really bizarre, because that was part of their process, from what I understand. That's what they typically do. And the law in the state of New Jersey and in the state of Maryland, and I think just about everywhere, is that if there is a suspected case of abuse, schools are required to comply with the law enforcement. So I thought it was pretty strange that they did not comply. The detective told me that they would only allow the parent to see the video. So I said, okay. So I had a friend to come pick up my son to keep him for the weekend until I got there. So that morning, I was on my way to the Bancroft School, and I received a call from Bancroft's risk management attorney who informed me that I could not see the video. It had to be court ordered. That didn't make sense. I mean, because if nothing was on it, like they said, what was the big deal? Why couldn't the detective see it? So that was a double red flag. So I contacted the detective to let him know I was in town and that they said I could not see this video. And he asked me, did I want him to subpoena the video? And I said, absolutely. Meanwhile, my son and I were talking, and I got multiple verbal reports from him, which were consistent each time. He informed me that the staff who he had reported was still working on the grounds. I thought that was kind of strange because typically when you're doing an investigation, internal or CPS, typically the staff is put on administrative leave during the investigation until the final result. So the fact that the staff was still at the school, he was afraid to go back because he feared retaliation. So I took my son home. So that evening after we got home, I contacted the residential unit to let them know I would not be bringing my son back until I received the final report from the internal investigation. When I called, it just so happened the gentleman who my son reported answered the phone. And I took that opportunity, like any special needs parent would, to ask him more questions. But I asked him, would it be okay if I recorded our conversation for the record? He was like, sure, so I did. So I asked the guy, I said, hey, my son told me that you tried to choke him. Can you tell me what happened in your own words? So he explained, oh, no, that's not what happened. I would never do that. I never put my hands on him. I would never do that. I'm a supervisor. That's not, my role. And he was just telling me how he never had to use a restraint. Red flag number 3. Now, at that time, the detective had not yet seen the video. So I didn't know what to expect. About a week later, the detective contacted me and said, hey, I'm on my way back over to Bancroft to look at the video. They called me and said I could come back. And I'm like, well, wait, I thought you subpoenaed the video. Did they send the video? So I asked him, did you get a copy of the video from the school? He said no, but, they called me back to come and view it. Is that even legal? So after he reviewed the video, he called me back and gave me a detailed report. In his report, he mentioned that there was a moment when there was like a bear hug type of deal. He was very careful with his words. He didn't say restraint, kind of like he was trying to protect Bancroft. But the bottom line is there was an unreported restraint. Meanwhile, I really had not heard anything from Howard County. So soon after, I got a copy of Bancroft's final investigation report, which concluded that there was no substantiated evidence. I was shocked because the staff said he'd never touched him, and the report said that there was a restraint. Then I got a copy of the police reports, where the first report said that there was no restraint. There was basically no documented restraint. And the detective's report basically said there was a restraint or a bear hug. So somebody was lying. So at that point, basically, I let Howard County know I'm not sending my son back there. But my thought was they were going to at least investigate. Now, when I looked at the detective's report, it was not as detailed as what we talked about. It was interesting because his report just stated that he subpoenaed the video, but it didn't say anything about Bancroft not allowing him to see the video initially. Therefore, he had to subpoena the video. And it didn't say anything about Bancroft not complying with the subpoena, and he had to go back to the school to see the video. That was kind of insane. So the detective closed his case, even though there were two conflicting police reports. I did not understand that. Bancroft basically closed its case. It was kind of crazy because this whole scenario gave me a flashback to when my son had reported a staff who punched him on the top of the head at the Linwood School in Ellicott City, which is part of Howard County. And he got off the bus like holding his head, and when he moved his hand, there was like this huge lump on top of his head. And I just couldn't imagine that any staff could have put him on the bus and not have seen that. My son gave a full report, and it was a behavior staff who had punched him on the top of his head. I had gotten multiple reports from him, and his reports were consistent. And it was just really disturbing that this happened. So when I called the school, no one knew anything, of course. So I called the police to do a report and took him to urgent care. He was diagnosed with a contusion. When I requested to see the surveillance camera, I was basically told that no, it was for the internal staff only. It was just really disturbing. The school staff's report actually made no sense. It was just like mumble jumble. This was really troubling, especially during that time because, his speech wasn't as clear as it is now. But at the same time, he was able to get his point across and express to me what happened. So the detective had him to come in to give a verbal report. So I had already given my report and I wanted to go with him, but I wasn't allowed. I mean, he was a minor. They would not let me go with him. There was a two-way window where I could watch him give his report to make sure that, nothing was distorted from what he had to say, but I was not allowed, which didn't make any sense. Come to find out later, when we get the final report from this detective, the report was distorted. It was worded to make it sound like my son really didn't know what he was talking about. And I knew that wasn't true. I wasn't a witness. So I couldn't really go against anything that he had to say. But I had multiple videos of my son giving his report consistently over different time periods. And this wasn't what he had said. Very minimal questions were asked. There wasn't even a question asked about the location of the incident. There wasn't a question asked about the time of the incident. These are things that my son could have reported, and those were really important pieces of information because it ended up that this staff was off duty during those hours, but this happened during lunchtime. And he was on duty during lunchtime. Because this report was modified, I believe intentionally, pertinent information could not be extracted from it. Maybe those questions were asked, but my son was very quiet in school, so I don't believe anyone realized how much he could talk and how much he absorbed. But I believe that once this detective realized how much he could talk, any information that he provided and documented would have been incriminating against that school. It wasn't fair. And just a side note about the trauma, even now, he remembers all of this. And we had a recent discussion about a lot of the things that were going on in his life as far as like the abuse and things of that nature. And he remembers. And there's even information that comes out now that he didn't say then. Things that he maybe has suppressed or didn't know how to express at that time. It ends up that the staff had taken him to this building behind the school, which I had toured. And at that time, it was mainly just a building with a lot of storage stuff in there. But he was by himself with this person. I mean, anything could have happened to him. Thank God it wasn't more. The reality is there needs to be more cameras. Parents need to be allowed to view these cameras and more support for these students who speak out, because it's not acceptable to say that these students aren't a credible source because of their disability. I mean, my son is one of the most honest people out there. He just doesn't make stuff up like that to get people in trouble. There needs to be more consideration for what these students have to say. The fact that this police officer's report didn't include all of the pertinent information was the reality of what goes on behind closed doors in police departments, in hospitals, in schools, everywhere. And no one is being held accountable. It's easier just to say, oh, he has autism, he's not reliable. And it's not fair. My son didn't want to go back to that school ever again after that. And I didn't send him back because he was scared. He was literally so traumatized after that that anytime I would drive anywhere remotely close to that school, he would try to literally jump out of a moving car. Mommy, mommy, please don't take me back there. That's no way for any child to live. In fear of school, a place where they're supposed to have fun and make friends and learn and just strive for excellence and just, be a kid and really just live a real, true childhood. But this was like fighting off domestic violence at a young age. It's crazy. This was right before the Thanksgiving holiday. And I kept him out of school from that point on. His teacher, who would keep a regular communication log with me, letting me know what was going on, how he was doing in school, just dropped off the face of the earth. And I couldn't figure out why. So fortunately, his phone number was in this communication log, and I called him. I said, hey, where are you? And he told me that he quit because of the way my son was being treated. I was like, what's going on? And why didn't he tell me? He basically quit, he said, because of the way they were treating my son. And he told me that they would lock him in this quiet room. The quiet room had this little rectangular window, and they would put construction paper on the window and just let him bang on the door all day, screaming, let me out, because of behavior. And this was the lead behavior therapist's idea because she said it would break him, break his behaviors. That's just not how you do this. I don't understand where some of these people get their educational training, but that's not how it's done. And I'm not even a behavior therapist, and I know that. I'm just thinking to myself, you're a mandated reporter. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you report this? But I was just glad that he was telling me. So I didn't really get on his case too much about it because I wanted to know what was going on. But the reality is, teachers are afraid to speak out because maybe their careers are at stake. I don't know what kind of deal or contract is signed with Howard County and some of these teachers, but this was just not fair. This is a mandated reporter who was afraid to report for some reason. I know there's a shortage of special education teachers throughout the nation, but this is Howard County. I mean, I'm sure the salaries are great and this is the #1 school district. So what's the problem here? Maybe behind some of these closed doors, some of these teachers know what's going on and they're afraid to speak up. So maybe they leave. I don't know what's going on, but there's a shortage. But Mr. Bill Barnes and Dr. Savage went on TV talking about how there's a shortage and we're trying to recruit the best staff. But I don't know if you're going to get any staff if this is what is being done behind closed doors. And teachers with real morals and values are seeing what goes on behind closed doors and not wanting to be a part of it. I reported the incident to the special education department, but again, they didn't do anything. And this was in Maryland. Basically, after their internal and external investigation by the detective, there was no substantiated evidence. Because again, I mean, he's like 4th grade, I believe. He just didn't make stuff up like that. So after that report showing no substantiated evidence, but yet there was this huge lump on my son's head that didn't make sense and no one could explain, I didn't send him back there. That was like putting him back in harm's way. So instead, Howard County continued to send the bus routinely every day just so they can document, well, you refused, you refused, you refused. It wasn't that I was refusing, but Howard County wasn't doing anything to acknowledge my complaint or ensure me that my son was going to be safe at this school. Instead, it was just about sending him back. And at one point, it got to the point where, they were going to file truancy charges against me. But I had to speak up. And I'm like, look, I'm not sending my son back there. And when we finally did go to a meeting, it was like a bother. Like, what do you want? What is what we can do for you? We need to place him somewhere else because this wasn't safe. And if school systems are just going by routine, not checking to see if these students are really safe, that's putting students in harm's way. It's really more like special education students are just black ink on paper. They're just an IEP. No one knows what these students look like. They don't know their feelings. They have a face. They have feelings. That's why I always plastered a picture of my son on the binder of his IEP folder when I went to those IEP meetings so they could see, this is my son. This is what he looks like. He has feelings. He has emotions. He's a child. But the decisions that are being made within these school systems is heartless. The people are heartless. The staff involved really have no feelings regarding special education. I mean, I think that the only way to really solve this problem is just to wipe the slate clean and hire all new staff, train them properly, and then let's move forward. But the way things are going now, these kids are just fending for themselves. Parents are sending their kids to school thinking that they're safe, thinking that all the right things are happening on their behalf, when it's not always happening like that. The one fortunate advantage that I had that I would not have had if my son was under the age of 7 when this happened was he was able to speak. He didn't start talking until he was 7. So fortunately, when all this was going on, he could at least tell me. Anything that happened prior to that, I don't even know about, because he wasn't able to tell me. But now he can tell me. And the fact that he even has a voice, that's a great thing, but it doesn't mean anything. It's just kind of like him not having a voice when he struggled so many years to finally be able to speak. And then when he finally does speak, his words are suppressed. His reports are ignored. It's kind of like not having a voice at all. So I find out that Bancroft actually did not even report this incident to the state until 8 days later, probably because they didn't think I was going to come to New Jersey to try to see this video. So Howard County was made aware of all of this that was going on. And for me personally, I would think that with all of these red flags, you would want to investigate. Plus, Howard County's policy 1030 regarding abuse and neglect states that an investigation would be performed. I understand that he wasn't actually in Howard County, but he was a Howard County student in a non-public school at an out-of-state placement, and they were responsible for his care. So they needed to know what went on. There was no investigation. So meanwhile, my son is at home and I am struggling because I didn't plan on him being at home. There was no schedule, no plan in place, no daily routine, nothing. And he had depression because he missed being at school with his friends, but he was afraid to go back. He also was having behaviors from the residual thoughts of the abuse. And I reached out to Howard County and said, hey, look, can we get home and hospital for him? Some behavior supports for me at home, because I don't know what to do. This whole situation was just dropped in my lap and I have no support. And I don't know how to manage these behaviors because he's typically at the school. And I was not planning for him to come home until that following year. So at the same time, I requested counseling service for him because he was having like nightmares and residual thoughts of this whole trauma. And he already had pre-existing trauma. So this was new trauma on top of his pre-existing trauma. And he was just like a mess, like so depressed because he wanted to be at school with his friends, but he was afraid to go back. So I asked for counseling services. Now, according to Howard County's policy 1030 regarding abuse and neglect, it says that any student who reports abuse, witnesses abuse, experiences abuse, they are all entitled to counseling services through the school. So that's all I was asking for. My son was a Howard County student and had all the rights and privileges of any student in that county. However, he was denied all services. No counseling, no behavioral support, no home and hospital, nothing. So the biggest issue I had about the counseling was the fact that my son had New Jersey insurance, and even though he had insurance in Maryland, there was a very long wait to get services. So getting in to see a school counselor would have been much faster than having to wait. He also had compensatory hours from COVID that he had not used, and I requested that he be able to use those services towards his counseling. It was denied. Now, the thing about that was I had submitted a Maryland State Department of Education complaint on behalf of both of my children who did not have an IEP on file at their schools. My daughter did not have one on file for 2 years. My son didn't have one for over a year. Now, I didn't know this because we actually had an IEP meeting, and it was up to the person who transcribed that meeting to make sure that the school got those IEPs. They didn't get the IEPs. I found out about this later, and when I found out, that's when it made sense that some of the things that were going wrong was because the school did not have a copy of the IEP. So interestingly, my daughter's final report from the Maryland State Department of Education came back in July, and my son's report came shortly after. But both reports had a final result confirming multiple violations by Howard County. That's when the retaliation really began. So at this point, my son was at home. He had no services and no friends that he really stayed connected with from during his younger years when he was in school in Maryland. I was really just trying to get his IEP completed so we could start sending out referrals for different schools. We were supposed to complete the IEP by early July, but there was never any response when I asked about it. So I kept sending Howard County emails requesting an update on when we were going to finalize this IEP, but they were not responding to my emails. A representative from DDA, the Developmental Disabilities Administration, also sent multiple emails because they were trying to get him started services, but they also needed a finalized IEP. I wasn't too worried about Bancroft anymore because I knew he was going to end up losing his bed because Bancroft had a 14-day rule. And this 14-day rule basically meant that if he was not at the residence for 14 days, he would lose his bed. So we were almost at that point. So I finally got an email from Howard County stressing, oh my gosh, are you going to take him back because he's about to lose his bed? But I had no plans on taking him back because he was afraid and I was afraid because no one was really monitoring him. I found out that Howard County was not even monitoring him for basically the entire time that he was at Bancroft. They were not going to his residential meetings. I mean, just not doing what they were supposed to do as per the Interstate Compact Agreement. The Interstate Compact Agreement is an agreement between the two states that anytime a student is going to be placed in an out-of-state placement, this is something that should be completed. And the receiving state, which would be Bancroft, would sign off, and the sending state, which would be Howard County, would sign off. I couldn't understand because I know this Interstate Compact Agreement meant that, they both had dual responsibility for my son's care, but no one from Howard County was initiating anything. It made me wonder what their status was regarding this Interstate Compact Agreement. Something seemed really off balance about this Interstate Compact Agreement. So I contacted the Deputy Compact Administrator through the Department of Human Services to find out what was going on. Come to find out, Howard County submitted the documentation to get the Bancroft School approved so that he could attend, but never submitted documentation on his behalf to file with the state. So there was nothing on record that my son was even out of state. So does that mean the state of Maryland didn't even know that one of its students was out of state? Could that be the reason why there was no investigation? Because nothing was on record, so therefore you either didn't have to do it, or if you did do something, then that would be a red flag for you? I don't know. I'm still not clear on that. But what's even more unclear is the fact that this is just such a cruel act. Because my son could have died out there, and Howard County wouldn't have been responsible for anything. So this prompted me to go back and look at the one document that they would give me that I signed. Now, I requested and I was told that I was going to get a copy of everything, but I never got anything except for this one document. And even trying to get this document was like pulling teeth. So I remember signing this document and I went back to look at it, and the document was pre-filled out. And this pre-filled out document had my name listed under a section called name of agency or person responsible for planning. And I remember clearly asking, what does this mean? Because why was my name under the section for agency or person in charge of planning? I'm just the parent and you're placing my son at this school. So what does my name have to do with anything as far as placement? So when I asked the lady who is the coordinator at the time, she's since then left, but She specifically told me that, oh, that's nothing. That just means that you'll make sure that you have insurance on file for him. You'll make sure that he has transportation and, things of that nature. So I had no one else to ask or no reason to not trust what she had to say. But I still wonder if that was really what it meant. Or was I the responsible person for him and no one told me? I mean, if I was the responsible person, just tell me I'm the responsible person. Don't send him like 250 miles away and he has no responsible person. No responsible person in the state that he comes from. So now he's in a situation where he reports a staff for attempting to choke him and no one from Howard County says anything. That is a beyond quadruple red flag. And the interesting part was I specifically contacted the director of special education, Dr. Terrell Savage, sent her an email and copied everybody in the world on this email and asking her, who was responsible for my son out of state? Simple question. I was expecting to hear, oh, Howard County, we're responsible. We're responsible. I mean, they attended the IEP meetings, so maybe educationally, but it's still an unclear question that never got an answer. The email was read a bunch of times, but I never got an answer to that question. So if someone doesn't answer a question, that must mean the answer is something that you don't want to hear. I had also received an email from Bancroft's risk management attorney who informed me that there was no contract between Howard County and Bancroft. So during the time when this incident occurred, there was actually no contract between Bancroft and Howard County. So who was managing his care? It got to the point that I started copying the county executive, Calvin Ball, and a lot of other people, including Howard County Board of Education. And nobody was responding. They were opening my emails because I have email tracking, but nobody would respond. I mean, they opened the emails a lot and nobody responded. I mean, I was just simply trying to get information so I could get my son services, but no one responded. That is what gave me a high index of suspicion that there was retaliation going on, because from the point when those reports came back from the Maryland State Department of Education, everything was delayed. It was like in slow motion. And I could not get any help. And if I did get a response, it was so backwards. It had nothing to do with what my email was inquiring about. So in early August, I sent an email to Dr. Martirano, the superintendent, and all of the members of the Board of Education. So in this email, I put a lot of attachments, including the 2 conflicting police reports, the final investigation report from Bancroft, in addition to offering Howard County the audio of the person in question regarding the abuse. Initially, I did not get any response. So on the 14th of August, I received an email from Mr. Bill Barnes, and he said he was responding for Dr. Martirano and was requesting to set up a telephone meeting. So I was like, okay, so that was good, because at least I felt like I was making some progress. So the meeting was set up for the 15th. On the 15th of August, Mr. Barnes called me and we talked for over an hour. I mean, it was like an hour and maybe 10 minutes or something like that. And during that time, I literally poured out my whole heart. He was so kind, so warm, and just very nice and, just wanting to help. So I felt like, wow, this was really good, because I had never had anyone who was trying to really help me. And I just really poured my heart out, and I just told him about all my concerns, because he asked me, he said, hey, what are your concerns? We want to get to the bottom of your issues and start getting some things moving for you. And I was excited about that. So I really poured my heart out to Mr. Barnes and just told him everything about all of my concerns regarding both of my children's issues. And he listened, like really listened. I reiterated all of my concerns regarding the incident at Bancroft. I talked to him about my concerns regarding my son not receiving any services. And my biggest concern the biggest concern out of everything was placement. I wanted to know what the deal was because school was about to start in about a week or so, and he had no placement lined up. So Mr. Barnes, he listened and he listened to all my ideas. I had suggested maybe like home and hospital and bring like a behavior staff into the home and all these different things. So he said he was going to be looking into everything. He understood my concerns. I talked to him about the lack of communication between the staff, everything. And I was really excited. So Mr. Barnes said that he was going to get Dr. Savage involved, and I didn't really see the point because I had actually talked to Dr. Savage some months prior in person when we were at an event, and she knew about all of my concerns regarding my children's IEP, and nothing was ever done. So I didn't anticipate anything was going to get done at this point. So we were talking about all these different options. Maybe we could do this, maybe we could do that for my son. So he arranged a meeting for August 21st that would include Dr. Savage, himself, me, and the coordinator of compliance, Miss Patricia Gunshore, who was also now my son's technically case manager or facilitator. So Ms. Gunshore was the person I had been trying to communicate with all along, and she was just not responding. Ms. Kerr was another person who was his prior caseworker, and she wasn't responding. So nobody was responding. After that meeting, I was so excited because I actually received a follow-up email from Mr. Barnes listing all of my parental concerns. I mean, this was just like a dream because nothing like this had ever happened to me before. He mentioned that the team was actively pursuing placements for my son. He communicated the fact that I was not interested in a residential, and he would confirm that during our meeting. And if there were any other things that came up prior to that meeting, he would get back with me and share all of that. He mentioned that Ms. Gunshore would give me updates at that time as well. This was a really good meeting. I was so excited because I felt like finally progress. It was like a relief. I could actually breathe, a breath of fresh air to have someone who actually did their job. On the 21st of August, I was really excited to meet because, school was about to start and he still had no placement lined up. During that meeting, I was literally blown away. I was devastated because I was so excited when I talked to Mr. Barnes, and he had given me so much hope. But during that meeting, I realized that it was deception. I realized that Mr. Barnes' actions and motives were all deceptive. I was so devastated because I had really poured my heart out to him, expecting real results. And when we got into this meeting, it was almost like we had never even had a discussion. It was more like he had amnesia. Nothing that we had talked about was discussed in this meeting. So the meeting was basically carried on by Ms. Gunshore, who informed me on that day that on August the 8th, 2023, she had a private meeting with the vice president of Bancroft, and they determined that they were going to hold my son's placement at Bancroft. Now, this was August the 8th. They made this decision behind my back, didn't invite me to the meeting. I'm his advocate and his legal guardian and his parent, for goodness sakes. I didn't even know about this meeting. And I had been asking about placement, had been emailing about placement. I had a meeting with Mr. Barnes about placement, and they had a private meeting about placement and didn't inform me. I just couldn't believe it. I was so shocked because that is just like a massive violation of my son's disability rights and my parental rights. So Howard County had basically decided that they were going to continue to fund this placement until my son's 21st birthday, which was October 8th. That was close to 90 days. So he would not have a placement that was safe, at least. And on top of that, they were marking him absent every single day for almost 90 days. They did not have the decency. Howard County Special Education Department did not have the decency to inform me about this meeting, to inform me about their decision to include me in this decision, I was literally blown away. So, of course, I advocated hard and heavy because I'm like, look, my son doesn't feel safe there. I don't feel safe there. You guys aren't even monitoring his care. There's no contract in place. I didn't understand how it was possible that they could make that decision behind my back, but they did. So I went back and forth, but it was just like Mr. Barnes just sat back, like it was like waiting for a cat fight. The thing was, he said in this meeting that he moved 3 chess moves ahead and he foresaw this coming. Why did he foresee this coming when he could have just told me and we could have talked about it that day during that conversation? So he deceived me. That was betrayal. I lost every ounce of trust that I had in Howard County at that point, and I did not have very much. But I lost more trust in Mr. Barnes. And just knowing that he is currently the superintendent is disturbing. Because if he could do something like that to me, he'll do it to someone else. But yet put up the facade that they care about special education students. Ugh. I was just literally disgusted after that. So when I told them that I was adamant that I was not sending my son back there because he was afraid, and I was afraid because nobody was monitoring him. Nobody was overseeing his care. Basically, I was given my Maryland safeguard parental rights to file for due process. File for due process? Are you serious? That process, number one, would take so long. And secondly, why would I file for due process when I should have been at that meeting to advocate for my son so we wouldn't have to go through this? I wasn't given any options. My son wasn't given any options. I said, he doesn't have a placement. The response was, well, he does have a placement. So basically, no services were going to be provided in Maryland because all services were available at the Bancroft School in New Jersey. Despite my son's fears of returning and my concerns about him returning, my option was to file for due process or send my son back to Bancroft. This decision to send my son back to Bancroft was made based on Bancroft's final investigation report, which during that meeting, I was informed by all 3 staff, Mr. Barnes, Ms. Gunshore, and Dr. Savage, that none of them had even seen that report. They hadn't even seen it. Now, I sent it in the attachments, but no one bothered to look at it. That's how I know no one looked at it, because I sent it to them. Bancroft was clearly lying. I had clear evidence that there were conflicting reports, and Howard County made a decision to keep my son in harm's way. So Howard County made the decision to violate the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, and not provide my son with FAPE, a free, appropriate public education. Now, according to them, they were providing him FAPE because he could go back to Bancroft. But part of Howard County policy says that students would be in an environment that was conducive for learning. That wasn't conducive for learning for my son. That wasn't even a safe environment for him. He was abused, for goodness sakes. There was an unreported restraint. There is a process for that. And Howard County didn't even bother to follow the process. They didn't bother to investigate, nor did they bother to even request the video to see what actually happened. So they didn't even know what happened. They had no clue. They just blindly made a decision to place my son in harm's way. That was gross negligence. That was mean and just evil. If it were one of their children, they wouldn't dare settle for any such thing. But my son was supposed to just settle or don't get an education. That wasn't fair. That was a violation of American Disabilities Act because technically that's retaliation. And parents and legal guardians have the right to advocate on behalf of a student. And I had that right, but they stripped that right away from me by not allowing me to advocate for him. And all of this occurred after receiving the Maryland State Department of Education final report. So yeah, retaliation was in full effect. And I really couldn't do anything about it except write emails. And I was writing a bunch of emails, copying everybody, getting no responses. I would have to say the one thing that bothered me more than anything about this whole situation was the fact that I had to refer Mr. Barnes back to my email. The email that he said that he had shared with the staff and had discussed and reviewed, all the attachments or whatever. I had to go back and refer him to that email so he could see the evidence that was submitted. And it was unbelievable, the response that I received when I told him to go back and check that email. The only response that Mr. Barnes sent me after a decision had already been made about my son's placement based on a report that they had never seen, his response was, "My bad." But even after receiving all of the information, reviewing all of the documentation, which he said he reviewed, no decision was made to reverse that placement. And my son still was at home alone with no placement. So I was trying to figure out why they would hold his placement until his 21st birthday. But as I journeyed, I realized holding him at Bancroft denied him the ability to receive the many resources and services that were available to him when he was under 21. After 21, you can transfer to adult services. The Bancroft School had sent me an email September 27, 2022, stating that they could not provide the counseling services. So they were recommending an alternative placement, which Howard County was supposed to be working on at that time. Ms. Care supposedly was working on that, but there was always a delay. She was even supposed to be working on getting him housing through Bancroft's admissions department, but never told me that she just basically stopped looking because they had already made a decision. Now, this meeting was a private meeting between Howard County with Miss Jessica Care and Bancroft. I wasn't invited. I was not invited. The decision was made that an alternative placement needed to be found for him. The crazy part about this is the Maryland State Department of Education had already confirmed that it was a violation that my son did not have a placement, and Howard County needed to find an alternative placement for him. Regardless of them knowing that Bancroft could not provide the counseling services for him, they still placed him at Bancroft, and Maryland State Department of Education didn't do anything except give me my parental rights. It was also noted at this meeting that there was an issue regarding the restraint policy, and Ms. Care had to go back to Howard County to get this addressed by her supervisor. But nobody told me about this, and I didn't know that there was an issue regarding the restraint. So I didn't really know what was going on. I started to include the Maryland State Department of Education on these emails as well, Miss Allison Barmatch. She's the attorney who pretty much comes to these final conclusions. And basically, I got no help. When I told her, hey, Dr. Monterano is not responding, nobody's responding. And she was basically like, well, I can't make them respond. But the MSDE report did say that he had to have a placement by October 8th. That put no pressure on them to expedite anything, but that's what it said. So finally, the IEP was finalized on August the 27th, and referrals could start going out to other schools. But they were sending referrals to residentials. And I said, no, he was not going to another residential. They said because he came from a residential, he had to go to a residential. But the only reason he was at a residential was because the school was out of state, not for any other reason. If the school was in Maryland, he could have came back home and went to school in Maryland because he had been in the hospital for so long and he was pretty much stable at that point. They gave me a hard time with this. So finally, he had a therapist, and his therapist wrote a letter to Howard County stating that it wasn't advisable for him to go to a residential because it would induce more trauma, and the fact that when they had discussions about residential, he got really anxious and he became more behavioral. So this wasn't going to be a good thing for him. So they just ignored whatever she said and pretty much just did what they wanted to do anyway. After the IEP was completed, I found all of these mistakes on the IEP. And I let them know, hey, look, we need to have an emergency meeting so that we can correct these mistakes, because otherwise some of the schools would not accept him. They didn't care. They didn't even bother to make a meeting. I mean, nothing. I didn't hear anything about a meeting. So you would think that once a finalized IEP is completed, referrals will start going out. The first referral was sent out and received on September 13th. And it's not like there was a delay in the mail system because it was electronic. This was literally insane. When I tell you things were slow, it was really slow. Everything was like moving in 2-week cycles. Every 2 weeks, there would be an action. Every 2 weeks. It was like an intentionally planned delay. The first 2 weeks was the middle of the month. The second 2 weeks, the month is over. It was like a steady, intentional plan to delay my son's placement. Intentionally wasting time. This was his last year of school, and school had already started, and he was nowhere near being placed. This was just cruel. I mean, maybe I was being viewed as this problem parent, but it wasn't that I was a problem parent. I was just really literally wanting the best for my kids. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. And I was just thinking that the people who were in charge of that would just simply do their job. So what happens to problem parents is an act of retaliation through their children. So you treat my son terribly. You delay his services. You delay his education. All of this just to get at the problem parent. I have a very high index of suspicion that that's what this was all about. So my children had to suffer because I filed a state complaint on their behalf. So that made somebody mad. So now I'm the target, but services are not being provided to attack me. My son is the one who's suffering from that. Yeah, it hurts me, but he's the one who ultimately suffers, not the parent. Wow. So in early October, I received a call from Dr. Savage. She was like really anxious and, oh my God, so willing to get him placed, and he needs to get FAPE, and we can make a public school work, and all of this. And I had been told by the director of a high school, Miss Missy Baxter, that public school was not an option for my son. And I had mentioned, well, maybe we can, create a program and whatnot. It wasn't an option. And basically that was the end of that. So I was really surprised to hear Dr. Savage say that public school was an option. So I wanted to hear more about that. So Ms. Gunshort used that opportunity to jump on the bandwagon and have the meeting regarding the corrections on that day as well. The meeting was held 1 month later. That's not an emergency meeting. So at this meeting, there was a discussion about non-public placements. And I was kind of hesitant about some of the placements, but I was open. The main one they wanted to keep pushing was the Strawbridge School. And that was the school where he had that whole initial trauma where he was transitioned out of his classroom. So I didn't think that was going to be a good thing to do. And his therapist said that wasn't a good thing for him. But they didn't care. So I took my son to go and tour the Strawbridge School anyway, because otherwise they would say, oh, you weren't compliant, so therefore we don't have to do anything. So we went to go and tour the Strawbridge School. Immediately, what I noticed when we got there was his head that was upright and kind of confident at first. When he got to the door, all of a sudden his head went and it was distorted in like this direction, and he would not make eye contact with anyone. That was so weird because I remember when he was going to that school, at times he would come home in that position. And I was like, what's up with that? So there was something not right about this place. And there was something that was making him uncomfortable where he couldn't speak freely. His head just kind of distorted. And I wasn't feeling that. So I asked him, did he want to go there? And he said no, he didn't feel comfortable. I reported to Howard County that that was not going to be the school for him because he didn't feel comfortable. I didn't feel comfortable, especially after seeing that. And with his prior history, it just wasn't a good fit. So I said no. I felt like that's the direction they were pushing him in anyway. So that was really the only school that we toured because supposedly the other schools had denied him. Well, was that because you would not make the corrections on the IEP? And I said that they would probably deny him. My son did not have a placement. So, according to the Maryland State Department of Education's final report, their requirement of Howard County was for my son to have a placement by October 8th. October 8th came and it went like the wind. And my son still had no placement. Also, part of the requirement was that they had to provide compensatory services for that entire year that my son did not have an IEP. That was required by September 15th. September 15th came and it went with the wind. And there was no compensatory services. There was no action taken by the Maryland State Department of Education when Howard County violated the requirements that they had set for the county to complete by a specified date. So basically their actions were, it's okay if you don't have it done. You're Howard County, you're number one. So therefore that makes it okay. So for number one school districts, we make exceptions. Wow. So I kept pushing the public school option. Finally, there was an IEP in October 25th. This IEP was to have a discussion about a public school program that would be created for him. Arrangements were going to be made for us to do a tour at one of the public schools that had an alternative learning program in addition to a regional program, which was a program that offered additional behavior and emotional supports. That's what I had requested anyway, but I was told no, that wasn't an option. So Ms. Gunshore was in charge of creating this program for my son, and we had determined that we were going to have 2 behavior staff on board for him, and Ms. Baxter was in charge of arranging the tour. It took Ms. Baxter 3 weeks to schedule a tour for a local public school. When I say things were delayed because of retaliation, I'm telling you, they were delayed. So finally on November 13th, we went to go and tour the school, and my son did amazing. I mean, he did fine with the bell sounds, with the changing classes. He did fine in the cafeteria with all the crowd. A student had accidentally bumped into him and, he just said, excuse me. So he was doing good. He interacted with the staff appropriately. He was asking good questions. He did great. We went to the special education classroom and he interacted with the other students, and he really did an amazing job. When we left, we were really sure that he was going to be starting school soon. I did not hear anything for weeks. So I reached out to Howard County and I didn't get a response. So finally I was told, oh, we're still looking for behavior staff. That was the delay. Meanwhile, my son was really going through a lot of depression. He wanted friends. He didn't have anyone to talk to other than now his new therapist. He was really becoming withdrawn, and it bothered me that he was even just sitting home watching cartoons. So I tried to homeschool him, but that didn't go well. So I really needed help. So I received an email from Miss Jessica Kerr, and she was my son and my daughter's former caseworker. The email that she sent was setting up a date to review my daughter's FBA. My daughter graduated that May, and here we are in December, and now we're going over her FBA. So my response to her was, hey, look, I think the more important picture here is that we start working on my son's placement versus going over my daughter's FBA when she already graduated about 7 months ago. So you can see where that's going as far as a violation is concerned. So shortly after, I got an email from Ms. Gunshore stating that my son was going to be starting Guilford Park High School. I didn't understand because we'd never toured Guilford Park High School. I wasn't even given an option. It was just like a done deal, take it or leave it. There was no IEP to discuss this or no team involvement. It was all one person making this decision, or maybe more than one person behind the scenes, but she was in the forefront. I had questions about this school and I wanted to see it because I'm like, I can't send my son there when he had never even seen it and he needs to be comfortable with the environment. So I did some research on my own and I found out that this new high school was only at the time accepting 9th and 10th graders. The oldest student was 15 years old. My son was 21. Who was he going to interact with? Who was he going to graduate with? That made absolutely no sense. I remember having a conversation with Miss Allison Barmat from the Maryland State Department of Education in either late November or early December regarding my concerns about my daughter. I just so happened to ask some questions about my son and the placement. And I was like asking questions like, how come, no one is doing anything? Why isn't the superintendent responding? One of the things I remember her saying is that she had been in close connection with Howard County and she was following my son's case. Well, I was sending a lot of emails with complaints. However, she said, well, I thought everything was okay because I hadn't heard from you. But I was sending emails, copying her on them, and she was opening them. Howard County supposedly told her that everything was fine and, they were doing everything they were supposed to do. So I remember speaking to Miss Barmat about this whole placement issue regarding my son. And from what I understand, Howard County informed the state that my son was going to be placed at Guilford Park High School in August of 2023. However, he was not placed until January, 5 months later. Now, I was sending emails complaining, and if there was a discrepancy in what I had to say and what Howard County had to say, when my emails started coming in with complaints, you would think the state would have reached out to me to say, hey, parent, what's going on? No one reached out to me. No one responded to my emails from the state. Nothing. So Howard County was basically filling the state's head with all kinds of foolishness that was not true. Howard County has a way of twisting its words, making everything so confusing. But I also realized the Maryland State Department of Education does the same thing. So we went on the tour of the school and I met with his teacher, who I found out was also one of his behavior supports. So since there was so much concern about his behavior, him needing this special program, I was concerned as to why they would assign a female staff and a very short, petite female at that. The second behavior staff had not even gone through her whole process of being onboarded to Howard County. So the only person who was going to be in the classroom with him was his teacher. And I certainly didn't feel comfortable with that. There were no other students. He was literally secluded in a part of the building and isolated in a classroom by himself with just his teacher, no peers. I was so unbelievably shocked. I couldn't even figure this thing out. I had a problem with that, but I said, well, let me give the program a chance so I can see how this works before I just turn it down. So I knew I had problems with it because when I got the schedule was so remedial. It was not anything for a student who was 21. My son had no transition plan. Matter of fact, he had no transition plan for over a year. During that time, he had no IEP. And now he really had no transition plan because he had an IEP. There were things on his schedule that were so remedial, I just couldn't believe the simplicity of it all. 30 minutes for check-in when you arrive, 30 minutes to check out when you leave. How are your feelings? That took 30 minutes. Then there was another set of that foolishness for 30 minutes at a different time during the day. Then there was 30 minutes for math, 30 minutes for reading, 30 minutes for job skills. There was time built in for iPad time. You could choose to take a nap or watch a movie. School started at 7:50 a.m. His bus picked him up at 9. School dismissed at 2:30ish, 2:35. His dismissal was at 1:30. So he was not getting his hours. And on top of that, the schedule that he had was like for a kindergartner. So I sent a certified letter regarding all of my parental concerns. So in this certified letter, I addressed all of my concerns, not in any specific order, but I addressed all of my concerns. The first one was there were no age-related peers. My son, age 21, and all of the other students in this school were 15 and under. The second concern was the fact that my son was secluded in a certain part of the school. He was isolated in a classroom by himself, and he had no peers. On his IEP, one of his goals is peer interaction. He had no peers. So how do you interact? So that was my question. Ms. Gunshore went along with me on this tour, and I asked her, I said, social interaction is on his IEP. How is it that he will interact? Her response was, he can talk to his teacher. Wow. I reiterated the fact that this was an IEP goal. Her response to me was, he had to earn social interaction. So based on good behavior, he would be able to engage with other peers. First of all, there were no peers his age to relate to or to engage with, because I'm sure other parents would have a concern about their 15-year-old or 14-year-old engaging with a 21-year-old. So that just wasn't appropriate. Secondly, I have never seen it documented anywhere in any of the federal regulations or guidelines that a student has to earn services in order to meet his IEP goals. So good behavior, you can interact with the 15-year-olds. He had good behavior for a month straight. He never had an opportunity to interact. My next question to her was, well, this is his last year of school. Who is he going to graduate with? Well, being that there are no other seniors here, he'd have to graduate alone. That was just like a stab in the heart, because my son was looking forward to graduation, looking forward to being with his peers. And now he's in a situation where he is with no one. When he was at the Bancroft School, at least, he was socially interacting with his peers. He was interacting, doing work-related duties in the classroom setting. These were things that he needed to build on. Social skills. Because that is one of the problems that the majority of the students with autism, when they graduate, they have a deficit in that area. Social skills, transitioning, communication skills, things of that nature. So this was the time for him to get this. Not after he graduates, but now. When we went to go tour the public high school, he visited a classroom with like peers. And now he had no one. That was definitely a concern. The next concern was the fact that there was inappropriate behavior staff. Now, first of all, I was told that he could not start school unless both of the behavior staff were there. The second behavior staff was not on board until February 2024. So it was almost a month before this other staff started. Meanwhile, my son is in a classroom by himself with just his teacher. There's no cameras in there. There's nothing to protect him if anything happens. If there's a behavioral incident or if there's a complaint that something happened that shouldn't have happened, there's no one to vouch for him. No witnesses, nothing. That made me very uncomfortable. Him being in a classroom by himself with his teacher, no other person there, it would have been her word against his, which is how it usually ends up in these cases. The reality is he would have no voice. Then the fact that there were two behavior staff that were females. So my son, big, young, strong guy, but at the same time, yes, he has behavior challenges. So you place two females with him, that doesn't even sound right. The fourth concern was the fact that this curriculum was just jacked up. The schedule was just not appropriate for a 21-year-old with a transition plan. But oh, he didn't have a transition plan. So maybe that's why it looked like that. According to the federal law for IDEA, students at his age are required to have a transitional plan that is adequate. Whatever that was not adequate. The answer I received was, well, as per the way his IEP is written, he is getting the services that he is required to receive. So that made me go back to look at his IEP. The IEP was completed in August, but there was nothing major that was changed on that IEP to warrant him receiving services any less than what he had received before. Or at least I didn't think that was the case until we get to concern number 5. After reviewing the IEP in further detail, it appears that the IEP was amended without my parental knowledge or consent. Now, social interaction, social skills, all of that was a part of his IEP. That section of his IEP was completely amended. So basically, he didn't have any social interaction on his IEP. Therefore, it wasn't being provided. So that gives you the right to seclude him and isolate him because the IEP was amended without my knowledge or consent. When I asked about this, the response I received was, well, you had 5 days to review the IEP and you didn't say anything. In the state of Maryland, for some reason, it is not required to sign off on the IEP. Due to the circumstances that I was under with my son being home, I had challenges I was dealing with. Then we haven't even talked about my daughter yet and the fact that there were challenges going on with both of them together. I did good to read as much as I did on the IEP. My expectation was not to have to go back to an IEP that the team had already completed and search for little things that were amended and pick those things out and bring them to anyone's attention. I should not have had to search for altered documentation that was documented illegally. So the only way I knew something wasn't right was because of the services that he was receiving, or rather not receiving. Another concern was the fact that during that entire time he had been at that school, he did not receive speech therapy one time. One time he received counseling, but that was it. He had been at the school for almost 2 months. So I was still trying to figure out why would he only have one counseling session if he's had some emotional issues during school. That section of his IEP was completely deleted, gone. So basically, even though he was entitled to that service because it wasn't written on the IEP, technically he didn't have to have it. Now keep in mind, we're talking about a student who has a significant mental health history with post-traumatic stress disorder, who has been hospitalized nearly 1,000 days, who has behavior challenges, who has emotional disturbance, anxiety from his past history, yet the social emotional piece of his IEP is completely deleted. How about his IEP was like nearly 50 pages long? So I'm supposed to trudge through all of these pages to find documentation that should not have been changed? I think that's asking a lot from a special needs parent. The IEP was amended without my knowledge and implemented in this new school setting. The next concern was my son's school hours. He was not getting the hours that he was supposed to be receiving. He was entitled to 33.35, I believe, and he was literally getting 20 or under. Based on the very simplified schedule that he was receiving, technically he really wasn't even getting 20. So he really wasn't even receiving FAPE. The thing was, it took Ms. Gunshore 2 months to create this program for him. 2 months to create this kindergarten program and 2 months to hire staff. And I was informed he could not start school until all staff were on duty. He started with one staff on duty and started in a program that was totally inappropriate for him. And she told me that his needs were not being met in the meeting. She made it very clear in this recorded meeting, because I record all of my IEP meetings, they know that. And she informed me that she was aware that his needs were not being met, but he could just get compensatory services. I didn't want him to just get compensatory services. I wanted him to get his IEP goals met at school with his peers so that he could be in the setting. I didn't want to have to wait until after he graduates and then go out and search for places for him to get social skills and all of that. No, that's not how it's done. That's how you get over. That is a sign of someone who puts paper over people. It's paper over people. It's all about just getting the documentation right and then let the parent figure the other part out later because he's about to graduate. The next concern, which was, I would have to say, the most concerning out of all of these things, the most concerning, even more concerning than the amended IEP. False documentation. This was major. During this entire time that my son was at school, he had 2 behavior incidents. That's it, just 2. One wasn't so bad, but I'm still not clear about really what happened, to be honest, because the documentation just wasn't clear. The second incident was really disturbing. The bulk of this all starts when documentation was being sent home at the end of the day. The times are on the schedule. I'm looking at the documentation, and every day it's saying 9 o'clock, he's doing this. 9:10, he's doing this. 9:30, he's doing this. The thing is, his bus picked him up at 9 o'clock. It took about 15 minutes or so, depending on traffic, to get to the school, maybe even 20 minutes. So if it's documented that at 9 o'clock he was in class doing his check-in, but he was on his bus, how is it that you can be in 2 places at one time? I addressed this to Howard County. I was like, look, this is what the documentation is showing, and I'm not understanding it because one of the behavior incidents that occurred, it was documented at 9 o'clock he was at school, and at 9:10 he was in the midst of a behavior crisis. But at 9:10 he still wasn't at school. I didn't understand that. How is that? I'm not even sure if the rest of the day was correct. Behaviors are a determining factor for many of the decisions that are made for this student, and it's documented that he's in the midst of a behavior crisis when he's not even at school. This is really disturbing. To document a behavior report falsely with inaccurate times for a student who has a history of behavior, that is the most cruel thing that a person could do to a special education student. The problem here with this false documentation, him being in a classroom by himself with his teacher, what if she would have said, oh, he punched me in the face, or he touched me inappropriately? What if? He would have had no protection. It would have been her word against his, which is how it usually ends up in these cases. I've been down this road several times. Trust me, I know. It all works out in favor of the staff. And the staff could be lying like crazy. When you look at these police reports and you look at these school reports and hospital reports, everything is altered to favor everyone except the student. And the student is typically the most reliable person in that situation. Oh, I have plenty of stories I could tell you about that, but that's not what this video is about. So after I brought this up in my certified letter that was addressed to Miss Patricia Gunshore, and I copied Mr. Bill Barnes and Dr. Terrell Savage, there was nothing that was really said. The outcome of that was, from that point on, the end of the day behavior reports went home with no times on them. So I connected with the teacher and I was like, hey, look, I need you to put times on his schedule so I can track his day and track the events and know at what time things happen. That only makes sense. You don't have a student going to school and they have a schedule with no times. How will they know where to be and at what time? So this teacher, I mean, I don't get it, but she would not put the times. She just responded and said, well, you know what's going on during the day. We talked about that. You have the initial schedule. Okay. I still wanted the times, but she refused to put the times. So interestingly, for that behavior incident, Miss Gunshore just so happened to be at the scene at the school. It's like, why? Who does that? The coordinator of compliance is at the school with one student during a behavior crisis? She said, well, they called me, so I came in. Okay, so on February 22nd, that was a really crazy day because I had the police at my house because my daughter was having major issues with her behavior. And now my son was having an issue at school. So they called me from the school to come and pick him up. So when I got to the school, guess who's in the lobby? Miss Gunshore is in the lobby. Now, coordinator of compliance, don't you have like an IEP meeting to be at or something? She's in the lobby. I hear my son screaming upstairs, yelling, and I said, let me go upstairs and calm him down because I didn't want things to escalate where they had to get grassroots and cops and all that stuff involved. So I didn't know really what's going on. So I said, let me go calm him down. I can calm him. I was prohibited from going upstairs. I'm waiting in the lobby and she says, well, they're going to bring him down. The staff will bring him down to you. I'm waiting in the main office for my son. Then I notice that he's being snuck out the back door of the school. He was put in handcuffs and put in the back of a police car and taken to Howard County General Hospital. I ran outside full speed. Wait, let me talk to him. I can calm him down. They had already called the cops and grassroots. I could have calmed him down, but I wasn't given that opportunity. I was furious. This false documentation was an absolute 100% setup. No cameras, no witnesses, wouldn't let me come upstairs, which makes me now realize that's probably why I couldn't come upstairs. Was this even a provoked type of behavioral incident? Guilford Park High School is right next to a prison. So the way they were treating him, it was kind of like a pipeline to the prison. Handcuffing him and taking him to the hospital, re-traumatizing him. Miss Gunshore was aware police officers were triggered for my son. Even though he likes police officers, it was a trigger for him because of his many hospitalizations. And that was just so cruel how she allowed that to happen. You can say whatever you want. You can document whatever you want because it's the teacher's word against the student's word. And because he's autistic, who's going to believe him? It's her word over his. Who do you think they're going to believe? I had a staff actually tell me that at the hospital when my son was abused at the hospital. It's my word against his. Who do you think they're going to believe? And it's true. Regardless of the fact that my son is one of the most honest and trustworthy people who actually gets upset when he sees another person being treated unfairly, he would be considered not a credible source based on his disability. Is it fair? No. Is it the reality? Absolutely 100% yes. The cops wouldn't even let me talk to him, and I couldn't figure out why. I told them, I'm his legal guardian. I mean, it was clear that he was a student. I'm his legal guardian. I'm his parent. Let me talk to him. I know he's 21, but he has a disability. Let me talk to him. Ma'am, if you want to talk to your son, then you'll just have to meet him at the hospital. So I went to the hospital. I snuck in the back door so that I could be with him. And I ended up getting escorted out of the area by the security guard. I was trying to give his medical history, trying to give all of the information because he can talk and he could answer some questions, but there are things that he couldn't answer on a medical level that only I knew. The doctor, everyone, they were treating me like I was this parent that they heard about. And they jumped on the bandwagon and was treating me some kind of way. So instead of allowing me to be an advocate for my son and to be with my son to provide the proper information so it could be documented correctly, I was escorted out of the emergency room and taken to the lobby by security, where Miss Gunshore and another staff were sitting. Interestingly, the nurses came out and went directly to the school staff before they came to me. They interacted, talked. I didn't know what was going on. I'm like, who does that? I'm the parent, not them. I couldn't believe my eyes. This happened like twice. So, of course, I'm on social media making a TikTok video because I'm like so upset about what was going on. And this was happening. This was like really happening in real time. And I could not go and see my son. He was scared. He was screaming. He was crying. I couldn't even be there. I felt helpless, useless. I felt like this bad parent that could not be there for her child. I felt like I needed to do more. But if I would have done any more, I probably would have ended up in jail. So I waited. And eventually my phone died. So I had to go and get my charger from home. I had to go get some food. Before I left, Miss Gunshore and the other staff walked out by me. And that was that. So later the hospital called me and they were like, oh, can you come back? He needs you here. We can't get him to calm down. Well, probably because I told you, I needed to be there. Medications, I don't even know what injections he was given, nothing. So later I got a copy of the police report and I went to the patient portal and pulled the hospital report. When I looked at the report, I thought I was literally going to pass out. Literally going to pass out. So the police report stated that a school staff advised that my son was not a student at Guilford Park High School, but instead he was in a mental health program at this school to help him with his autism. That, I swear to you, I have a copy of the report, is what it says. I was so unbelievably floored. I just could not believe that that was said. Who said it? Probably, well, I can't tell you 100%, but I can't imagine the teacher saying that because she was the teacher and she was employed by the school to teach him. Then I looked at the hospital report, and the hospital report stated that a staff advised that basically the home was the problem. So the plan was for them to contact CPS and they were going to recommend a residential. That sounds like something that was rigged by Howard County. Why? Because they knew they could not meet his needs and they needed to find a way to get him in a position where he could not be at Guilford Park High School where his needs could not be met, but in a placement where his needs could be met. That way, their hands were wiped clean because we met his needs. Interestingly, and this is just so insane, about a week or so before that incident, I received an email from Miss Gunshore stating that my son would be starting the Strawbridge School on March the 4th, and bus services were being arranged. Now, we had already determined that the Strawbridge School was not a good placement for him. His therapist said it, I said it, my son said it, and we had not heard back from the Strawbridge School since we toured in October. So now all of a sudden, 3 to 4 months before his graduation date, they have a placement for him. When I did the tour, There was a concern about him transitioning so much. So now we're going to transition him from the public high school to the non-public school where his first initial trauma began when he was removed from his high-functioning class to a class with one peer that cursed all day. You want to send him back there? This was wrong. This was wrong. This was a predetermined placement. There was no IEP to discuss this change. I mean, no IEP. There was supposed to be an IEP for any change that takes place that is not on his current IEP. No meeting, no discussion, no contact with me, nothing asking me any questions about anything, nothing to inform me ahead of time. It was just an email. This is where he's going. Like it or not, March 4th, we'll have a bus there to pick him up. On the morning of March 4th, my family and I were on a plane traveling nearly 1,500 miles away, so my son could attend a public school program that would respect him and provide him the services that are on his IEP. We traveled this distance simply so my son could receive FAPE. FAPE is a standard requirement for every public school system in this nation, as per the U.S. Department of Education. It is a federal law that every public school system provide its students with a free and appropriate public education. It is illegal to deny a student with an IEP FAPE. Yeah, his education was free, but it was far from appropriate. They go hand in hand. So that is a federal law. The public school system receives a lot of money from the federal government. Now, for special education students per student, I believe it's like $15,000 or $16,000. Don't quote me, but it's a pretty nice chunk of change. And if you're a number one school system, then you may get a lot more money. So maybe that's a motivation to be number one. That makes me wonder, because during that time that my son was not in school, from July up until January of 2024, where did that money go? The money that was allotted for him, where did that money go? And when we left, where did the remaining portion of that money go? It's interesting because it sounds like a misuse of federal funds to me. And it's so funny because I filled out a whistleblower complaint. And just to tell you how crazy this whole system is, I was the whistleblower, but the whistle was blown on me because my email was actually forwarded back through the system to Howard County. So crazy. Once I sent this email as this whistleblower, emails just kept opening left and right from both Bancroft and Howard County. Boom, 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 all over the place. And then I sent an email to the lady who I had spoke with regarding the whistleblower complaint. And I asked her, did you forward my email to anyone? Did you let them know what was going on? I mean, I thought this was confidential. She was like, oh, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am? You forwarded my information that was supposed to be confidential to the county? To be honest, I could care less because they already knew they were wrong. But if I were someone who was really trying to keep something under the wrap and be, totally anonymous, I'd be in a whole heck of a lot of trouble. So I won't be doing that again. So regarding the compensatory service hours, we had a meeting in October, and those hours were going to be discussed at that meeting. This was initially supposed to be provided to me by September 15th, but it wasn't. But I requested that this is something that we talked about because I wanted to make sure my son was granted all of his compensatory hours that he was entitled to. So at this meeting, it was planned that this was going to be a part of the discussion. However, Ms. Gunshore was not prepared, and she was like, I'm just really not prepared. I had so much going on. And I was very kind about it. And I said, okay, She said she'll get it together and she'll contact me. We'll get another meeting. That meeting didn't take place until February of 2024. And when we had that meeting, my son was denied all of the educational services that he was entitled to from the time he left school in July up until October 8th. Even when he started school, the amount of hours that he received doesn't reflect what he should have gotten because he totally did not get his hours. But when I tried to use those compensatory hours, there was a delay. As recent as May 2024 and July 2024, I had requested to use these hours because they expire in 2026. So I wanted to get started with using them, especially with the summer coming up. I wanted him to take advantage of some programs and whatnot. And I got no response. And the response that I did get was so delayed that by that time, the program was filled. So they didn't have any space for him. So I sent another email regarding like another service I was trying to get. No response. Everything was literally just delayed. So if we don't start using those hours soon, they're going to expire before we even have an opportunity to use it. The response, even to date, is so slow. And even when we relocated Howard County, they just abruptly discontinued his service hours that he was using to get therapy. In the midst of that whole transition to another state and starting another school and all of that change, he was without his therapist for 2 months. And he struggled a lot during that time. So finally, the services were restarted back, but it's just like dangling a carrot in front of the bunny. You can have the services. Nope, you can't have it. You can have the nope. So that's what it feels like. Just for completion's sake, I think it's only fair for me to provide you with the findings from my complaints. Let's start with the Maryland State Department of Education. Allegation number 1, provision of the student's IEP to the out-of-state residential school. Each public agency must ensure that a child's IEP is accessible to each regular education teacher, special education teacher, related services provider, and any other service provider who is responsible for implementing that IEP, as well as the specific accommodations and modifications and supports that must be provided for the child in accordance with the IEP 34 CFR 300.323. So based on the findings, Maryland State Department of Education did find this to be a violation because the IEP was not provided to the Bancroft School. Therefore, the school did not have access to the services that he was required to receive. And it's documented by the state that this resulted in the supports and services not being provided for the 22-23 school year, in accordance with 34 CFR 300.101 and .323. Allegation number 2. Ensuring that the student's IEP included psychological services and counseling to address the interfering behaviors. Based on the findings, Howard County Public School has not ensured that the student's IEP included appropriate psychological services and counseling to address interfering behaviors since May 2022, in accordance with 34 CFR 300.324. Interestingly, Howard County did not provide my son with compensatory services for psychological counseling services during that school year that he had no IEP, because the Bancroft School provided them with some false documentation stating that they were providing these services all along. However, it's not documented anywhere on his prior IEP, nor was it documented on the current IEP because there was no current IEP. The Bancroft School provided me with an email on September 27th, 2022, stating that they were requesting an alternative placement for my son because they could not provide him with the psychological services and counseling, and they stated that he would really benefit from that service. Because they could not provide it, they were recommending an alternative placement. During that time, Ms. Jessica Kerr, my son's former caseworker, was supposedly in the process of looking for placements for him outside of Bancroft, because Bancroft had already determined that they could not meet the needs for the psychological services and counseling. So during that entire year, no one was looking for placements for my son. Matter of fact, Ms. Kerr was supposed to be working with the Bancroft School's admissions office to find him off-campus housing because supposedly the campus housing that they had at Bancroft was only for pediatrics. And at age 21, he would have to leave. So at some point, apparently she had just stopped looking and did not tell me because Howard County had already made a decision to continue his placement at Bancroft. So the really interesting part here is Because Bancroft said that they could not meet his psychological counseling needs, you would think that Howard County would have been more on top of finding him a different placement. However, instead of finding him a different placement, during that meeting with Mr. Barnes, Dr. Savage, and Ms. Gunshore, they decided to keep him at a placement where his needs really couldn't be met. Bancroft created some documentation for Howard County stating that he was receiving these services all along. Did they forget that they said that they could not provide the services? At that point, I received an email from Howard County with all of this documentation showing he was getting all of these services throughout the years. But nowhere on his IEP was that documented. So not only did Howard County, without my knowledge or consent, maintain a placement where my son could not receive the psychological services and counseling that he was required to receive on his IEP, they accepted false documentation from the Bancroft School, which resulted in him not receiving any compensatory services for psychological services and counseling for the entire school year that he had no IEP. The only way the state could find this to be a violation is if there is no documented evidence that those services were provided. Well, it was found to be a violation. However, in August of 2023, suddenly there was this mysterious documentation that just appeared, created by Bancroft, provided to Howard County, showing that my son was receiving psychological services and counseling over the years, even though none of this was ever documented on his IEP. If it's not on the IEP, it's not done. Moving right along, allegation number 4, 5, and 6, educational placement, evaluation of the student, and provision of documents prior to the IEP team meeting. Regarding allegation number 4, determination of the student's placement. In determining the educational placement of a child with a disability, each public agency must ensure that the placement decision is made by a group of persons, including the parents and the other persons knowledgeable about the child, according to 34 CFR 300.116. Additionally, this placement must be determined at least annually based on the child's IEP and as close as possible to the home, according to 34 CFR 300.116. Moreover, in selecting the least restrictive environment, consideration should be given to any potentially harmful effects on the child or on the quality of service that he or she needs. Interestingly, it mentions the least restrictive environment. I wouldn't call secluding a student in a certain part of a school and isolating him in a classroom the least restrictive environment. That seems like the maximal restrictive environment. It also mentions that any potentially harmful effects or the quality of the service should be considered in making a placement. Well, first of all, it states that this decision needed to be decided by a group of people, including the parent. I was not invited, therefore I was not included. Secondly, it also states that considerations for any potentially harmful or quality of care and service should be considered when making a placement. I wouldn't think that it would be an acceptable practice for any school district to maintain a placement for a student who has already reported an incident of abuse. The student has expressed that he is afraid to return due to retaliation. The parent has expressed concerns about returning since there are no monitoring tools in place, and no monitoring tools were still in place at that time. If there were no monitoring tools in place that the school system could provide to the parent to assure that child's safety, I can't understand why the child would be forced to go back to that environment and the parent would be forced to make that type of decision. This should not have been an option. Allegation number 5, evaluation of the student. A public agency must ensure that the reevaluation of each child with a disability is conducted if the public agency determines that the educational or related service needs, including improved academic achievement and functional performance of the child, warrant the reevaluation, or if the child's parent or teacher requests the evaluation. These evaluations must occur at least every 3 years. MSDE found this to be a violation by Howard County because my son's reevaluation period was supposed to be May 2022, and it was not done. Allegation number 6, provision of documents prior to IEP meeting. So basically, this was a violation because Howard County did not ensure that I received a copy of his IEP at least within 5 days after that scheduled meeting. So in conclusion, the Maryland State Department of Education provides student-specific requirements and systemic requirements of the county. So regarding the systemic requirements, this is basically just homework for the county to do, to develop tools and to come up with reasons why and how are they going to do better and things of that nature, not anything that's going to really affect my child, as at this point, I was not sending my son back to this school. However, the student-specific requirements, MSDE required that Howard County provide documentation showing that they had met with the IEP team by September 15th. And this included determination of appropriate behavioral supports and services, transition activities, and placement has been completed for the student. Well, during that time, there was no placement completed, but Howard County just basically ignored the student-specific requirements that were required of them by the state. It stated that he was supposed to have all these compensatory services calculated by this time, which was not done. So these are the student-specific requirements that Howard County was held to have completed by September 15th, 2023. As we know, his placement didn't occur until January 2024, and the compensatory services were not granted until February 2024. And the state did nothing regarding these massive, significant delays, but they're number one. So what do you expect? So on September 25th, 2024, I sent a complaint to the Maryland State Department of Education because I had written an email to Howard County regarding concerns that I had, multiple concerns. In this complaint, my main request was to have Howard County to respond to my concerns. That was it. So instead of receiving a response from Howard County, I received a letter from the state, and they are answering for Howard County. Basically regarding my complaint that I raised concerns regarding Howard County Policy 1030, which was the abuse and neglect, Title II of the American Disabilities Act, the Interstate Compact Agreement, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1974, which was based on retaliation. And it goes on to say that, the Maryland State Department of Education, they're unable to investigate issues related to those concerns. In order to address Howard County Policy 1030, that I would need to file a complaint with Howard County, which I made them aware Howard County was not responding. So how do you file a complaint directly with the county when they don't respond? No one responds. My expectation of the Maryland State Department of Education, since they had already documented that Howard County needed to have better communication with the parent, was that the state would enforce this and make Howard County respond to my email, which they did not. It also goes on to say that there is no individual right of action under the Interstate Compact, that a parent may take any type of legal action under the terms of the compact. This is a perfect example of how the twisting of words. I didn't say anything about legal action regarding the Interstate Compact. I just simply asked for a response from Howard County regarding my concerns, which none of this was ever addressed. So it also states that I raised concerns about my son's education record regarding false documentation and possibly inaccurate information regarding the Bancroft School provision of counseling services. And it goes on to further say that your son has the right to request to review the education record and whatnot, which was not what I was asking for. This was not what I was looking for either. I was looking for a direct response from Howard County, not from the state, to respond to my questions. So it also mentions finally that I have raised concerns about my son's placement at the Bancroft School he did not attend since summer 2023. And it goes on to say that there were many IEP meetings, many referrals to other schools, and many other proposals that were discussed during that time frame in question. Well, during that time frame that was in question, all I knew was that my son had a 14-day rule that if he did not return back to his bed, he would lose his placement. There were no meetings. There was no correspondence regarding his placement during that time frame until the 21st of August. So you can see how the game here is being played in this documentation, making it look like Howard County did everything in the world that they could possibly do to help my child to get on track. However, the reality is they made a placement and did not include me. It also goes on to say that Howard County is continuing to fund the placement until October 2023 is not relevant because they didn't force my son to attend Bancroft. Rather, they continue to seek placement or programs that you would be in agreement with. Are you serious? Funding a placement that a student was not required to attend is not a violation of the Individuals with Disabilities Act. Well, according to Howard County, if my son did not attend, then he would not receive the services on his IEP that are required under the Individuals with Disability Education Act. So I'm not sure what the state is talking about here. So how can you say that this is a placement that he's not required to attend? Because he's 21? Because he was over 18? I mean, under 18, I understand you are required to attend, but just the fact that he is a special education student under their care, this is a perfect example of the state twisting its words around, basically supporting Howard County, because this is clearly a violation. And they know that. If they go back and look at the final reports of the complaints that were made after each of these allegations, in those summaries, it gave clear violations that the state did not hold Howard County accountable for, which is why they skate through and have no consequences. I want to tell you briefly about my daughter's situation. My daughter was bullied big time. So just to give a brief background of my daughter's history, she was this typical sassy middle schooler who was really excited about starting middle school. She was going into 6th grade at Bonnie Branch, and her main goal was to be popular and have all these friends and, just to do so much. So I was really excited for her to be going into school with this fresh new attitude of excitement. So that first quarter, she did really well. She made some friends and she made the honor roll. But the second quarter, she started to kind of become more withdrawn, and she wouldn't really talk about her friends anymore or school or anything like that. And she would just go in her room and just kind of close her door, and I wouldn't see her for the rest of the night. I mean, she wouldn't even come out to eat sometimes. I was like, something's not right with the situation. So I tried talking to her, but she would not talk to me about it. So just before going back to school after the holidays for the third quarter, that's when she mentioned to me and her grandmother that she was being bullied. She was afraid to go to school. So the first day back to school, I went to the principal, Miss Sherry Jones at the time, and I talked to her about what was going on to let her know my concerns, and she was very, amenable to everything I had to say. She said she would keep an eye out for anything that was going on. So I was like, great, this is good. Later on that year, the bullying continued, and it got to the point where my daughter was really super depressed, and she ended up being hospitalized for suicidal ideations. So I was like, this thing is really serious. So I had another meeting with the principal, and she said, oh, I'm on top of things. I was trusting that she would do what she said she would do. So later, the bullying was still going on, and we had followed the bullying protocol by filling out the bullying forms and whatnot, and nothing was really being done still. So my daughter was still spiraling down into these modes of major depression, and she ended up back in the hospital. So at that point, kids started making fun of her because she told them that she was in the hospital. And I told her, I said, don't tell anybody. And, middle schoolers, they're going to do what they want to do anyway. More than anything, she really just wanted to be popular and have a lot of friends. So one day she was walking, and some of the popular kids came up to her and said, hey, come walk with us or whatever. She was really excited because she was like, oh, they really accepted me, and that was her attitude, feeling that she was being accepted finally. She went along with them, and when she was walking in front of one of the girls at the bottom of the steps, she said that the girl slapped her on the back of the neck real hard and said something smart to her. So of course my daughter was really upset about that, and she ran upstairs to the principal's office, told the principal, and the principal contacted me about the incident, but she told me that it was just middle school girl drama. She never mentioned that my daughter was assaulted. She never mentioned that there was a recording of the incident, which I didn't find out until later. Another student had recorded this whole incident on another student's phone. The principal deleted the video and never told me it even happened. She just said the incident was going to be investigated and it was just middle school girl drama. So that's all I knew. My daughter didn't even tell me about the recording until later. I was really just waiting for the principal's investigation report because I was only told that it was middle school girl drama. I mean, that was really all. So I never heard anything back from her about anything. So later, the principal informed me that she did delete the video because she didn't want it to go on social media. Isn't that like a crime? So meanwhile, the bullying is still going on, and my daughter ended up back in the hospital multiple times, and she was actually in the hospital at the same time as her brother, right down the hall from him. When I went to visit, I was like there, then I was there. So it was kind of depressing for me to have both of my children in the hospital, and there were days that, my son wasn't even at home for Christmas. It was a lot. It was a lot. So at one point, after my daughter was discharged from the hospital, she went back to school, and she was sitting with some other peers talking about her hospitalization. I was like, why are you doing this? So it ended up that one of the girls had decided to spread this rumor and said something about my daughter threatening another student. But the crazy part is the student who she said she was threatening wasn't even at school that day. The staff took that and just like, oh my God, she's been hospitalized, so therefore she may really hurt somebody. So my daughter said she had just gotten to class and she was just waiting for class to begin when the school counselor came and pulled her out of class and took her down to her office. She started bombarding her with all of these questions, and she said she did not have suicidal ideations or anything like that. But the mobile crisis team was called, and then shortly after, the police were called. The police escorted her out of the school building in front of all of her peers and put her in the back of a police car. Kids were looking out the window, all kinds of crazy stuff. So of course, when she got back to school eventually, that was like the big talk and, the joke. They took her to the emergency room for a psychiatric evaluation, and she had just gotten discharged from the hospital the day before, so she was already cleared. Took her to the hospital for the psych evaluation, and she was banned from coming back to school until she had a threat assessment. But she said she didn't threaten anyone. Of course, Howard County wanted her to go in to see one of their psychiatrists, I guess, so they could document whatever. But because her doctor didn't do threat assessments, we ended up going to the county's doctor. But I demanded that I was in there with her because I did not want any funny business going on, especially after I knew how Howard County operated. We went in there and she was cleared immediately. She was cleared to go back to school. But after that, at that point, she was so withdrawn. She had lost a lot of time from school, and she really had a difficult time getting back on track. Her motivation for school and everything was just gone, literally just gone. She did not want to go back to school ever again. She was so embarrassed to go back to school after that. So we ended up having an IEP meeting. And once we had this meeting, it was determined that she was basically at that point emotionally disturbed. This was what the county labeled her as, but I couldn't really go against it because she really was having this massive depression. So the plan at that time was to transfer her to Ellicott Mills, which was a middle school that had a regional program that offered behavior supports and emotional support. So she never had behavior problems, but the emotional support, I knew she could benefit from that. So that was the only reason I agreed to that. So I didn't want her to go to school riding the special education bus because this was a new school, new beginning, and I didn't want kids to start labeling her and making fun of her. So the county gave me a really hard time about that, and they would not allow her to ride a regular bus. Once she got there, the bullying actually continued because she was on the special education bus. And on top of that, one of the students from Bonnie Branch was transferred to that same program that she was in, and he just started bullying back up again. So now she was at this new school and she was being bullied all over again. So she really had a hard time adjusting. It got to the point where she started taking these long bathroom breaks and these frequent trips to the nurse's office with these pseudo medical complaints because she was trying to avoid her bullies. So during this whole time, we were following the bullying protocol and we filled out the bullying forms, and we had done all of that at Bonnie Branch and at Ellicott Mills. So I couldn't figure out what the heck was going on because there was a bullying protocol in place, but no one was following it. So my daughter was previously in the general education classroom and she was doing fine there, which was why I wanted her to ride the regular bus. So the county recommended that she go into a special education classroom, and I was not feeling that, but at the same time, I knew she had lost a lot of time from school and she was kind of behind. So rather than her being embarrassed in front of her peers, I wanted her to have the opportunity to catch up and then mainstream back into the regular general education classroom. It ended up that Ellicott Mills was a complete disaster. Instead of handling the bullying issue by following the bullying protocol, the staff was recommending an alternative placement for her. So she was really struggling with these bullies and she needed a break. So because she had an IEP, we looked at all the different non-public options, but there were really no options for her because most of the schools were for students who were on the autism spectrum. She was not on the spectrum. She just needed to catch up. So a really unique program called Pathways was recommended, and it was really kind of cool because she would have her own teacher who would pick her up, and they would kind of go to different sites to do her lessons and whatnot. The only disadvantage to that school was the fact that she did not have the social interaction. And at first I was like, oh, well, that's a good thing because she needed to catch up and she didn't need to be so focused on all of her bullies, but she was not getting the social interaction that was on her IEP. So she stayed in this program for 2 years, and then she just really wanted to experience being a real high school student in a real high school, which I totally understood. So fast forwarding to the 2021-2022 school year, this was the year that she re-entered the public school system, but at the same time, she was a dual enrollee still attending the pathway school to do her main courses and doing electives at Howard High School. So the one stipulation that I had was that everything had to be in place for her so that she would be able to receive the proper services while she was at this school, because this was the first time that she was actually refacing her bullies. And everyone is older and a little bit more mature. I didn't anticipate her having too much of a problem, but you never know. So I wanted to make sure that was in place for her as a safeguard. So she was supposed to be getting like social and emotional support, some behavioral support, and of course, because she had an IEP in general, any educational needs that she needed at that time, she would receive. And the counseling was a really big part of that. So she started off great. She was a varsity cheerleader, and she was so excited because now she was finally popular and she was really doing well. So there were some kids who were kind of jealous of her because she was on varsity and they weren't. And a lot of stuff just transpired. So during that school year, the bullying recurred and she ended up getting assaulted by a peer. She sustained a concussion, ended up having to stop cheer for a while. It was just a big mess. I called an emergency meeting because I felt like there needed to be more supports for her in place because I didn't understand what was going on and why, how all this stuff was happening. There was like disciplinary action with suspension and all this stuff was happening. So I thought it would be a good idea, especially after that school year, to have a functional behavior assessment done to see where there were any deficits that, we needed to work on at that time and what was needed so we could help her during that next school year for sure. I signed the document for her to have the functional behavior assessment. So her annual review was rolling around that August, which ended up being delayed about 60 days or more until October 13th. So after the holidays, I noticed she started to display some, really risky behaviors that were not typical for her. And I had a high index of suspicion that something was going on, but I didn't know exactly what it was. So then the school reported to me that she was skipping class. So I was wondering, okay, is this like avoidance where, typically she had a flash pass where if she was under stress, she could just take a walk or whatever. So she had gotten accepted into the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. So I went into my email to pull her IEP to let them know that she had a history of an IEP and to see how they could accommodate her. But when I was looking for the IEP, I could not find it. And this was around the same time I was looking for my son's IEP, and neither IEP was in my email. That was really weird because it's normally there and I don't really go searching for it unless I absolutely needed it. So I needed it. So I didn't make a big deal out of it. I just sent an email to the special education department and said, hey, I need a copy of, both of the kids' IEP. It took a little bit longer than expected, but I did get it. So when I went through the IEP, I was specifically looking for the functional behavior assessment because she was demonstrating these new and risky behaviors. So it wasn't there. For some reason, I thought it was done. When I asked about it, come to find out, the functional behavior assessment was never done. So I'm like, what the heck? So because her annual review was delayed by 2 months, I forgot to ask about the functional behavior assessment, which was to be done that summer. So I had filed a Maryland State Department of Education complaint on behalf of my daughter because she did not have an IEP on file for 2 years. And only because I requested the IEP in March to prepare it for the University of Maryland did I realize there was no IEP. So when I asked Howard High for a copy of the IEP from the 21-22 school year, they did not have one on file. Then when I asked for the 22-23 school year, they still did not have one on file. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. We had an IEP meeting, so why is there no IEP? So according to the principal at that time, Mr. Novak, he said because they use a special type of system to store the IEPs and she was a dual enrollee, they did not have her information on record. So my daughter's at this school, refacing her bullies for the first time with no services provided from the high school. She had the services at the non-public school, but she did not have the services where she really needed it at this high school. That was one of the stipulations that I made before she even re-entered back into the public school system, that she had counseling, social emotional services, and behavior support when she went back into this school. So come to find out, she never had any of those supports. She was accused of cutting class when technically on her IEP, there was a accommodation for her to be able to have a flash pass to move out of her classroom if needed when she was in those moments of stress and anxiety. They didn't have any of that information because there was no IEP on file. I spoke with all of her teachers from the first school year and from the second school year at that public high school, and none of them were aware that she had an IEP. So in July 2023, I received the final state complaint. The state found that there were multiple violations by Howard County, including the fact that she did not have the functional behavior assessment completed and did not have an IEP on file. Now, the state only would look at the 22-23 school year because they would only go 1 year back. But my complaint was submitted in April of 2023. So technically, they were supposed to go back to April 2022. They would not do that. Instead, her complaint was dated starting the beginning of the 2022 school year. But she still had an IEP in full effect when that state complaint was submitted, and the state would not honor it, which was really insane because an IEP is a continuum. It's not like you could just stop an IEP in the middle of the school year and just keep it moving. So this was for the 2021 to 2022 school year, and they would not acknowledge it. My daughter was really excited about going to college and getting that whole college experience, but she was not very confident about going because a lot of things had happened during that whole bullying season, and she really had fell behind academically. So she didn't think that she would be able to keep up. The University of Maryland Eastern Shore had what they call a bridge program, and this bridge program would allow students who had a pending application to be accepted into the university to come to the school early for a summer enrichment program. So even though her status wasn't pending and she was actually accepted into the university, I wanted her to still go because I knew academically she could benefit from this program. She had some compensatory hours that were provided to her by the special education department due to COVID. So I requested that she be able to use those compensatory hours towards paying for that program. The process to even get those compensatory hours from the special education department was just a headache all by itself, but they agreed to pay for it. So I sent the special education department an email requesting the balance of her compensatory hours. Even though she had never used any of the hours, I just wanted to be assured that the whole balance would be covered. By this time, I had already submitted my state complaint. So I'm waiting for a response regarding the hours for the compensatory services, and no one's responding. So finally, I received a response, but I had only asked for the balance of her compensatory hours. I received this 4-page settlement agreement, Howard County versus me. I was like confused because I'm like, what is this? So this 4-page settlement agreement was offering to pay her first 2 years of college, in addition to multiple stipulations in exchange for my signature, releasing Howard County from everything that happened to my daughter from the beginning of time. Those were the words, the beginning of time. In addition to this, I would have to agree to never file another complaint. I could never speak about this issue to anyone. I could never go to court. All of this stuff. And I was like, what? I only asked for the balance of her compensatory hours. That was beyond disturbing because it was like saying, we really don't care about your child. We just want to wipe our hands clean of this whole situation. So in May 2023, my daughter was about to graduate. This is when Howard County Special Education Department initiated the functional behavior assessment. How was it going to be beneficial for her at this point? So fast forwarding to early July 2023, my daughter entered the summer bridge program at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. She was in the program for about 2 weeks before I got a call to come and pick her up because she had had a mental health crisis. When she got back home, I requested that Howard County provide her with counseling services because of the fact she did not have an IEP for 2 years. She wasn't even getting the services that she was supposed to be getting while she was at Howard High School when she was around a large amount of students. But now when she got into a very small group of students of 150, she ended up having a crisis. It would have been beneficial for her to get those services while she was at Howard High. The counseling services I requested were completely denied. So fast forwarding to August 15, 2023, when I had my meeting with Mr. Barnes. This meeting, like I said, I was so excited about it. And when I spoke with him about the concerns I had about my daughter, I addressed so many issues that were concerning to me. I told him about the functional behavior assessment that was not completed. I told him about the IEPs, and the response was, we're going to see what we can do to work on those services for your daughter. I went in there with great expectations and left miserably disappointed. I even informed him about how Howard County had sent me that 4-page settlement agreement. And that reminded me of an incident when I went to mediation for my daughter after in middle school when she was at Ellicott Mills. The principal removed her from all of her classes for 10 days. 10 days, especially even her reading class. She was having a really hard time struggling with reading. She was removed from all of her classes, and sat in the student services office for all 10 days. She had no teacher. She had no peers to interact with, and that was part of her IEP. Peer interaction, social services, educational services, all of these things. And she was removed from her classes for 10 days. No one even told me. No one told me. Talk about deja vu. I had no idea my daughter was out of all of her classes. When I found out, my daughter finally told me, and I asked her, why didn't you tell me? She said, well, I didn't think it mattered anyway because, they always blame me, so what's the big deal? It was a big deal. And for any student to think that it's not, it's just wrong. They were literally converting everything, turning all of her complaints back around and pointing it towards her mental health. That's what they did. Oh, she's got mental health problems because she's been in the hospital. But no one would address why she's been in the hospital. For ignored bullying because the staff would not follow the bullying protocol. So when I found out about her being removed from the classes, I immediately went up to school and had a face-to-face talk with this principal, Mr. Christopher Rattay, and informed him that I wanted my daughter back in her classes ASAP the next school day, which is where she was. He tried to turn it around and say, oh, I thought you were aware. There was never an IEP meeting for any changes like that. He knew I didn't know that. So she went back to her classes, but you cannot take a student out of a class for 10 days and expect them to pick up where they left off. That was the turning point in my daughter's life, right there. That particular moment. Not even the hospitalizations. It was that moment in her life. Because after being removed from her classes for 10 days, she was never able to catch up. Never able to catch up. And she was in 7th grade at that point. So because she couldn't catch up, that is part of the reason why she has the low confidence and self-esteem. So I told Mr. Barnes, this was a big turning point in her life. And when she went to that program at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, the Bridge program, she went into a mental health crisis because she was so overwhelmed. There were only 150 students. Howard High had like 1,800, which would have been the perfect place for her to get the services that she needed and get the practice, interacting socially, all of that. But no IEP for 2 years. So when she got to the University of Maryland Eastern Shore's program, not only did she freak out, but the words that she told me was that she felt stupid. She felt stupid. She did not feel like she could ever be on that level again. She didn't believe that she was honor roll material. So that really bothered me because I could tell from that point that her future was really kind of like up in the air. Like we can go this way or we can go that way. So even now, she struggles a lot because she never really received the services that she needed. Those skills, those coping skills, that interaction. She has difficulty with peer interaction socially. And she never really got that because Pathways didn't have any. And this was her opportunity to get it. But she didn't know how to get it because no one was helping her to get it. So the reason I mentioned to Mr. Barnes about this whole settlement issue and how it reminded me of a situation that happened with my daughter at Elegant Mills was because during that time when I went to mediation for my daughter in 2022 to get 19 hours for her, I was offered the same settlement agreement. So the principal, Mr. Rattay, was not at this meeting. Instead, a representative from Howard County, Miss Catherine Lyon, was there. And she was basically saying, well, we'll give you your 19 hours if you sign this document stating that you will release Howard County from everything that happened to your daughter from basically the beginning of time. I was like, what? Are you serious? No, I wasn't signing anything like that. It just didn't make sense that anyone would even offer such a thing. During this meeting, the ALJ said that the meeting was going to be recorded. And I thought it was kind of strange because he was recording it on like his iPhones. I thought maybe he would have like some kind of professional recording device. During that meeting, I said no. I did not want to give my signature in exchange for 19 hours. I just wanted the 19 hours because that's what she was entitled to. It ends up, the ALJ, I believe, was crooked and in some way in cahoots with Howard County because I made it very clear what I wanted. My mom was in there as my witness. The agreement that I made was that I would not come back for any more hours regarding that situation. So when the meeting was almost over, the ALJ wrote up the mediation document. So basically, Howard County got what they wanted by using that twist of words. The ALJ wrote in this mediation documentation, "and the foregoing," which I thought meant going forward, but it meant actually proceeding. So basically, Howard County got exactly what they wanted because anything prior to that date was forgotten, completely forgotten. And I specifically said that that is not what I wanted. So I thought at least I could go back and fall back on the mediation recording. So I contacted the office to get a copy of the recording. Then I find out, oh, mediations are not recorded. I strongly believe there was a conflict of interest with this ALJ because he knew and she knew. Everyone at that table knew what I had said that I did not want, but they wrote specifically what I said I did not want. I didn't have anyone with me except my mom, and neither one of us are lawyers. I couldn't believe it. Howard County had gotten over again without a trace of dirt, just got over completely. No accountability, nothing. So one of the things that really bothered me during that time period with all that was going on with my daughter at Ellicott Mills was the fact that we had this meeting. And in this meeting, my daughter's educational consultant was there, her therapist was there, and then there was a whole round table of about 12 people. So during this meeting, the behavior therapist and the psychologist were giving their spiel on what they were doing for her and all this other stuff. One of the staff, who was very familiar with my daughter, actually stood up during this meeting and said she couldn't do this. It wasn't right. The services that they said they were providing, my daughter never received. She never received any of those services. This staff was so upset about what was going on with my daughter that she cried and got up and walked out of the meeting. I just thank God that she spoke up because the reality is everyone tried to turn everything around to make it look like it was her when really the staff who were supposed to be providing her these services never provided the services. And I would have never known if she didn't speak up. That was a really important piece because here she is in 7th grade and staff are reporting, because remember, staff will report what they want to report, saying that she received these services when she actually did not. The room was quiet. Not a sound. You could hear a pin drop. But a few minutes later, it was business as usual, like nothing ever happened. You would think the following year that those same staff would not have been there. Well, guess what? They were still there, likely still documenting inaccurate information. Interestingly, I got an email to go over her functional behavior assessment. It was so twisted because she didn't have an IEP for 2 years. However, even though the state said that Howard County did not ensure that my daughter's IEP was provided to the teachers at the start of the 2022 to 2023 school year. Remember, they didn't even look at the 2021 to 2022. They started from the 2022 to 2023 school year, even though my complaint was submitted in April 2023. They said that even though this was a violation, notwithstanding this violation, MSDE finds that there is documentation that staff were aware of the behavioral needs of the student. And they were also aware of the supports that needed to be provided to her. Therefore, no student-specific corrective action is necessary. So you have a student where no IEP is on file for 2 years. So it's stated that Howard County did not ensure that the teachers had access. The counselor didn't have access. The psychologist didn't have access. Those were the only people who would have been allowed to have access. Anyone else would have been a violation because IEPs are confidential. Now, regarding the functional behavior assessment that was completed in May 2023, the month that my daughter graduated, the state required that Howard County would provide documentation by October 1st of 2023 to determine whether the delay in completing and reviewing that FBA, which was recommended on May 10th, 2022, had a negative impact on the student's ability to benefit from the educational program. Howard County did not have that documentation by October 1st, 2023, because we met on February 2024. When I went back to the MSDE report, it was clearly documented that that was a violation. However, Howard County had a staff at this meeting who was supposedly monitoring my daughter and who was a part of her care. Never heard of this person, but she was supposedly working with my daughter behind the scenes. Why behind the scenes if she needed someone to work with her in the scene? So this phantom staff who was actually at this meeting informed me that she was part of the team. She had just started that year. She made sure that the teachers and everyone had a copy of the IEP because she distributed it. If that were the case, why did the MSDE report state that Howard County did not ensure that the teachers had access to her IEP? So the staff was created, but if you're going to create a lie, then make sure you got everything in order, because that's not what the Maryland State Department of Education final report stated. It was already a confirmed violation, so why are we creating people? Maybe it's me, but I don't recall ever reading anywhere in IDEA or anywhere in the federal guidelines where it's okay for a teacher to know about what services need to be provided, but not actually have the documentation. Since when is just knowing that an IEP exists enough to meet the student's needs? No documentation on who met the needs, no documentation on anything. How would the state think that that is even okay? How is it documented that she even received those services? Where is the documentation? If it's not on the IEP, then it's not done. That's the rule that I learned when I first moved to Howard County. If you don't have the IEP, then it's definitely not done. Go figure. It was also documented on the state complaint that the teacher knew about it. Somebody had it, but we just don't know who. Huh? What? That made me wonder, is this a real state Department of Education? Because that didn't make any sense. The student-specific portion went on to say that if there was a negative impact, that compensatory services needed to be granted. So when we met in February 2024, the behavior specialist who performed the FBA presented her findings. Now, keep in mind, there is a format for completing an FBA. Miss Augustine, who was the behavior specialist who completed my daughter's FBA, did not at any point connect with me to gather information. And the parent information is a huge part of an FBA. She did not observe my daughter at the Pathway School. She contacted the school and got information by phone, but she did not observe her. I told my daughter someone will probably be coming in to observe the classroom. Let me know when you see someone. No one ever went into Howard High School to observe my daughter. The other huge piece of this story is the fact that when Miss Augustine did this FBA, she didn't even use an official Howard County functional behavior assessment form. It was literally a Word document that was created, some very basic, simplistic lines. It didn't have all the information on it, nothing. I have many functional behavior assessments through Howard County for my kids. I know exactly what the form looks like. This wasn't even an official FBA. This was just a document that was created maybe right before she went to bed, just trying to hurry up and get something done for the meeting. Maybe a draft, but even if it was a draft, it didn't have all of the information. So I submitted a complaint recently to the Maryland State Department of Education regarding my concerns about this. Because first of all, Howard County did not do what they were supposed to do by October 1st and have this meeting. And secondly, this wasn't even an official report. So the response that I received basically said, well, your complaint is outside of the timeline at this point. Howard County was outside of the timeline when we had that meeting in February and not before October. But my complaint was outside of the timeline. Therefore, I was given my parental rights to dispute. The fact that I had to pack my family up abruptly and leave just so my son could get the best services before his graduation date, I had to pull my daughter out of cosmetology school and she had to restart in the new state. The state that we moved to, they accepted many of her transfer credits. However, Howard County had agreed to pay 100% of her tuition. Once we moved, my daughter had a $1,200 balance because she had early withdrawal from the prior school, and there was a penalty for early withdrawal. So I didn't think it would be a big deal. I said, hey, this is what's going on, Howard County. Can you pay the balance? Because it's not our fault that we had to move because you didn't do what you were supposed to do and provide my son FAPE. They refused, and my daughter ended up having to take out a $1,200 student loan to pay the balance for her education in cosmetology school, which Howard County agreed to pay. Now she has a student loan that she's going to be required to pay back starting in about 6 months after she finishes school. I don't know the fate of my daughter at this point. So the likelihood is I will end up paying this back. I mentioned this to the state as well. They didn't care. And I was informed of my parental rights. So everything I've mentioned in this video, and trust me, there's so much more that I'm leaving out, but I just can't talk about everything. But the reality is, Howard County's interim superintendent, Mr. Bill Barnes at that time, was made aware of all of this information, everything, as well as the former special education director, Dr. Terrell Savage, who has now taken Mr. Bill Barnes' place as the chief academic officer. See, that's what I mean. Transition of job responsibilities up to the next bad leader. Leaders who do not really truly care about the outcome of special education students, leaders who do not care about doing what is right. This includes the state of Maryland, Maryland State Department of Education. They did not do what was right on behalf of my children. They are the ones who could have put Howard County in line, but they did not do this because why? Howard County is number one. And to maintain that status, you have to look like you're perfect. And they're not. So if you made it this far in this video, you are entitled to hear the final reports from the Maryland State Department of Education and any other reports that I have. So allegation number one, development of the student IEP. This was based on the fact that the functional behavior assessment was not completed in May 2022. Instead, it was completed 1 year later in May 2023. So the state found this to be a violation. Allegation number four, provision of the IEP document 5 days after the meeting. This was found to be a violation, the same as on my son's, because I did not receive a copy of the IEP within 5 days after that final IEP meeting. There was also another allegation regarding disciplinary action that was taken by Howard High School that had no IEP, therefore no modifications were made regarding the disciplinary action that was made. But believe it or not, that was found not to be a violation. Should have been, but it wasn't. But most importantly is allegation number 7. Now, I put my glasses on for this one. So allegation number 7 addresses teacher access to IEP at the beginning of the 2022-2023 school year. It states here that there was documentation from the neighborhood high school that Howard County had ensured that some staff working with the student were provided with copies of the IEP. The documentation does not, however, indicate which staff received the IEP. It also goes on to say that there was documentation that a staff at Howard High School supported my daughter and participated in the IEP meeting discussions related to her social, emotional, and behavioral needs. I'm not really understanding. I'm not 100% clear on who the staff was that they're talking about. Was it the counselor? Now, I know that the counselor and the school psychologist both attended the IEP meetings, but neither one of them had a copy of the IEPs. I am just not clear about this, because if we're talking about that same phantom staff, Miss Barbara Baker, who they're claiming was working with my daughter behind the scenes, because if this were the case and this particular staff said that she provided all of my daughter's teachers a copy of the IEP, then why was there no access? And why is this considered to be a violation? So moving on, Howard County acknowledged that there was no documentation that the students' teachers had access to the IEP at the start of the 22-23 school year. So the most important section here is the discussion and conclusion. And listen carefully. Listen carefully. In this section, it's stating that Howard County did not ensure that the students' teachers had access to the students' IEP during the 22-23 school year, and this resulted in the support and services not being provided in accordance with 34 CFR 300.101 and .323. Therefore, this was a violation. However, notwithstanding this violation, MSDE finds that there is documentation that staff were aware of the behavioral needs of the student and the supports to be provided to her, despite the absence of documentation that they had access to the student's IEP. Therefore, no student-specific corrective action is necessary to address this violation. I thought that was pretty interesting that Howard County acknowledged its faults and that there was no documentation supporting the fact that the teachers had a copy of the IEP, but somebody had it. We just don't know who, but somebody had it. I am not sure how it is even relevant. Maybe the state forgot that they documented that teachers not having access to my daughter's IEP resulted in her not receiving the supports and services that she was entitled to. Okay. So most importantly, under the student-specific requirements, it states that MSDE, Maryland State Department of Education, requires that Howard County provide documentation by October 1st, 2023 of the following actions. And the most important action here is the third one, which is here. By October 1st, 2023, the IEP team had to meet to determine whether the delay in completing and reviewing the functional behavior assessment that was recommended on May 10th, 2022, had a negative impact on the student's ability to benefit from the educational program. If it's determined that there was a negative impact, the amount and nature of compensatory services or other remedy to redress the violation and develop a plan for the provision of those services, at least within a year of the date of this letter of findings. So the interesting part here is Howard County had to determine whether completing and reviewing the FBA from May 2022 had a significant impact on my daughter. Now, maybe it's me, but I don't know how you can determine something from a year prior based on an FBA that was done a year later. So the decision was made based on Ms. Augustin's fake FBA that no impact occurred from 2022. I mean, we can't go back to 2022 and figure out what her needs were at that time. We literally can't go back in time. None of us. I mean, we're human. So based on the fact that we can't go back, you would think the state would not have even said any such thing. So therefore, those compensatory services should have been granted because she did not receive those services, but it was not. So in late September, I submitted a complaint to the Maryland State Department of Education regarding this and the fact that, those services should have been granted to her. Basically, what I was informed in this letter was that I had missed the timeline. So basically it was saying that my daughter graduated in the spring of 2023 with a diploma from Howard County Public Schools, and most of my concerns that I raised in my complaint were investigated in a previous complaint. The sole allegation that MSDE can investigate at this time is whether the Howard County Public School System followed proper procedures in determining compensatory services on February 20th, 2024, in accordance with 34 CFR 300.101. So the problem I have with this is Howard County did not comply. We did not meet by October 1st, 2023, which was required by the Maryland State Department of Education. So now I'm outside of the timeline because Howard County did not meet on time. I mean, it says right here, 2024. And their requirement of Howard County was to meet by October 1st, 2023. Well, I submitted my complaint regarding this before October 1st, 2023. And I'm considered to be outside of the timeline. And this was written by Ms. Barnett, who is the Chief Family Support and Dispute Resolution Branch Division of Early Intervention and Special Education Services. So she goes on to say that she understands that I may not agree with the outcome of the compensatory services for my daughter. However, I am incorrect regarding that IDEA mandates provision of compensatory services. In fact, IDEA does not mention compensatory services at all. And that compensatory services is really more of an equitable remedy that comes from litigation. Now, we weren't in litigation in the midst of my son's IEP meeting, and I was told by Ms. Gunshore, oh, he'll just get compensatory services. I'm not quite sure how litigation has anything to do with this and how that's even okay. And it goes on to say that there had to be other relevant information to determine whether my daughter would be eligible. How about the fact that she was assaulted? How about the fact that she was being accused of cutting classes? And this was what was documented in her record. However, it was mainly because the school had no IEP on file to know that she was eligible to have a flash pass. So technically, it really wasn't skipping classes. Also, my daughter and I ended up in juvenile court filing a peace order against a student who had assaulted her. So all of these things, I provided them all of the information, every single thing, every single piece of documentation. But that wasn't enough. I told them about the risky behaviors that she was experiencing and all of these different things. That wasn't enough. If that weren't enough, then I should have been told, well, this wasn't enough at that time. But no one said anything like that to me. So in conclusion, Ms. Barnett states that Howard County IEP team determined that there was no negative impact from May 2022. But again, how do we go back to May 2022? How do you know that for sure? So these compensatory services should have been granted to her regardless. She also makes it clear that MSD would not overturn that decision and only investigate the process through which the decision was made. And I mentioned the process. The process was fake. It was not a real FBA because it was not on an official Howard County form, and it did not have all of the documentation included in it, and it did not have any documentation included from me. This was in my complaint. However, that portion was not addressed. So the last complaint that I want to mention is my complaint to the U.S. Department of Education. And that complaint was sent in April 2023. And it was received in April 2023 because it was electronic. I received feedback from my daughter's complaint from Miss Andrea Del Monte, one of the team attorneys there who was handling my daughter's case. So I received a phone call from Miss Del Monte, and we talked for an extended period of time, and I was telling her what's going on. And she told me to send her more information. So I sent all the information that she requested. Soon after, I got a call from Miss Shannon Zipkin, who is a paralegal who was handling my son's case. And she had lots and lots of questions. We talked for over an hour. And same thing, she asked me to send a lot more documentation. So I did. So I was like thinking, okay, we are getting somewhere because there must be an investigation going on. They're asking me for all of this information. I mean, otherwise, why would you ask for anything? So periodically, I would follow up for an update. And basically, I was just told that, oh, we're still working on it. It takes time and whatnot. So now we're going into about 19 or 20 months since this has been all pending. And I didn't think there would be much to do because they asked me to send a copy of the state complaints. And I sent both of the finalized state complaints. Since they were already confirmed violations, that would make everything much easier, I thought. But I still, to date, have not received any information regarding an update. So in April 2024, I sent them a demand letter. Hey, look, send me something. Let me know what's going on because I've been waiting a year now. And I understand it could take time, but now we're going into 2 years. So this was giving me a high index of suspicion that this was like some type of connection with Howard County, that they were just trying to hold them over until whatever dates and statutes of limitation pass by. Another reason I believe that Howard County and the United States Department of Education were somehow in cahoots was because every single time the attorney from U.S. Department of Education or the paralegal Ms. Sipkin would open my email, Howard County would in turn start opening emails. And there were times where things had died down, no emails were open for weeks. Then all of a sudden, the U.S. Department of Education opened an email, and then Howard County started opening emails. Everything was in sync. One could say that that was merely a coincidence, but that, I don't know. That was kind of weird. I mean, like, what are the chances? I was really depending on the Department of Education to do what they were supposed to do, because what happened to my children was not right. It was not right. And to date, I am still waiting. And that was just the first complaint regarding the IEPs. Even with the second complaint regarding my daughter and my son, when the abuse took place and all that stuff with my daughter at the schools, that still hasn't been processed. I haven't even gotten anything other than a statement saying that they received it. But that information was sent almost a year ago, and I have not heard anything from the United States Department of Education. So I was told to reach out to Senator Chris Van Hollen or Congressman Sarbanes regarding any federal agency issues. And I did. I did everything I was told. And if you look in this petition below, you will find their responses. Senator Van Hollen's assistant, I guess, was responding and pretty much said, oh, well, they're not responding, so therefore I guess you're just going to have to contact them directly. So that was, I think, unacceptable, because if they're not responding to you, then what makes you think they're going to respond to me? And then the congressman pretty much just says, oh, well, I wish that I could help you, on this level, but I can't. And it was just like always a song and dance. So pretty much nothing has gotten done. I've gone to the highest level that I can possibly go. Everyone has a story. In all truth, I really didn't want to rehash this story again, because it hurts so much every single time I talk about it. I'll be honest, I did not want to share my story because of the intensity, reliving that journey. It was a lot for me. It took me on an emotional roller coaster, behind the scenes, the tears, the heartache from just knowing that my children actually lived through this. But they didn't live through this in vain. This whole situation was not in vain. It happened for a reason. And I believe the reason is for me to share this video so that you will know what really and truly goes on behind the closed doors of Howard County Public School System. It is the #1 school system in the state of Maryland, and Maryland ranks #3 in the nation for education. But ask yourself, after hearing my story, how is it possible that 2 children in the same home could have this experience? And go through this journey without anyone stepping up to the plate on their behalf, except me? It was even hard for me to get an advocate, a paid advocate, to do the right thing, because everyone was in cahoots with Howard County. Even when I contacted people to ask for help, the first question was, what county is this? When I said Howard County, everyone shuts down. There is something in the milk that's not clean. I don't know what it is, but I do know is the actions of this administration is not only corrupt, but it is unacceptable for any staff to violate a student's disability rights and to violate a parent's parental rights. Reflect on my story. It's real. I have receipts. Everything I say, I have receipts. I would not take a risk and put myself out on the line to provide false information. This was real. My tears were real. My emotions were real. Everything about rehashing this journey was real. I just really wanted my children to have a really good education. And there are days I beat myself up because I feel like maybe if I would have left sooner, things would have been different. Or maybe if I would have done things differently, managed certain situations differently, things would have been different. Maybe if I wouldn't have made them mad, things might have been different. So I do beat myself up. Sometimes I feel like I'm this bad parent. who should have made better choices. But then I picked my head up and I realized the best choice that I could ever make for my children is to speak out on their behalf. And I'm not speaking out for just my children, because for them, the damage has already been done. I'm speaking out for all of those students who cannot speak out for themselves, and for all of those parents who are afraid of being retaliated against. This is for you. Remember, nothing will change unless you initiate the change. These systems will continue to operate corruptly, taking advantage of parents, taking advantage of special education students, especially if you don't speak up. School districts are good for labeling parents as the problem parent. But remember, the squeaky wheel is the one that gets the oil. And I promise you, I am one of the squeakiest wheels that Howard County has ever encountered. But my family, we didn't go through this for no reason. This is to help someone, and this is to make a change. But I could not settle going through all that we went through and not share my story to help someone else. There needs to be more done regarding these students, because what's happening at this point in special education is just not right. It's just not right. And I am encouraging parents to really speak out, tell their stories, and just put these school systems on blast, because this cannot keep happening. And we are talking about a #1 school system where people flock to. I flock to Howard County to take advantage of this school system. And this is what my children got in return. It's not fair. It's just not fair. So I just want to take the time to thank you all for watching this video. I am hoping that each of you will be courageous enough to stand with me in taking legal action against Howard County Public School System and demanding the resignation of its superintendent, Bill Barnes. And to the parents out there with special education students, you have to stand up for your children. Stand up, tell your stories, put these school systems on blast, because this is not fair what's happening to them. And they cannot keep getting away with not being accountable for their actions. There is power in numbers. And if we all stand together, we can make a change. So please start now by signing this petition. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please share it, not just with parents, but with everyone, because our children are the future. And if we don't stand together now, they may not have a future. Thank you again for watching, and stay blessed.